Imagine standing in a cave in what is now southern France. It's 40,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries. You're holding a torch made from juniper wood wrapped with animal fat, and the flickering light throws dancing shadows across the rough limestone walls. In your other hand, you're holding a mixture of red ochre and animal fat, ground together into a paste that stains your fingers. You can feel the weight of what you're about to do, even if you don't have words for it yet. You're about to paint. You're about to create the first art humanity has ever known. Not just marks or scratches, but real art. Images of horses running, bison charging, lions hunting. Pictures that will still exist 40,000 years from now, long after your bones have turned to dust, long after your entire world has vanished. You don't know it yet, but the thoughts in your mind right now, the images you're about to commit to this wall, they're going to echo through every generation of humans that ever lives. You're standing at the moment humanity woke up. Here's the thing nobody tells you in history class. Humans had been around for a long, long time before this moment. Anatomically modern humans, people with bodies and brains identical to ours, had existed for 200,000 years. That's not a typo. 200,000 years of people who looked just like us, thought with brains just like ours, walked on legs just like ours, and for most of that time they did almost nothing. They made simple tools, they hunted, they gathered, they survived, but they didn't paint, they didn't carve, they didn't innovate, they didn't spread across the entire planet and dominate every ecosystem they encountered. They just existed, generation after generation, doing the same things their great-great-great-grandparents had done 10,000 years before. Then something changed. Around 40,000 years ago, something happened inside the human mind. A switch flipped, a door opened, a spark caught fire, and everything, absolutely everything, transformed. Suddenly humans were painting masterpieces on cave walls, creating intricate tools from bone and antler, making jewelry and musical instruments, trading materials across hundreds of miles, telling stories complex enough to need illustration, burying their dead with ceremony and grave goods that suggest they believed in something beyond this life, planning months and years ahead, building social networks that spanned entire continents, and most importantly, they started innovating. New ideas, new technologies, new ways of thinking appearing and spreading faster than anything the world had ever seen. Within just a few thousand years, these humans had replaced every other human species on Earth. Neanderthals, who had dominated Europe for 200,000 years, vanished. Denisovans disappeared from Asia. Homo erectus, who had survived for nearly 2 million years, went extinct. By 30,000 years ago there was only one human species left standing. Us, our direct ancestors, the people who painted those caves. This is the story of the most mysterious transformation in human history, the moment we became truly human. The question that's haunted archaeologists and anthropologists for decades. What changed 40,000 years ago? Why did humans who had existed for 200 millennia suddenly explode with creativity and innovation and world-dominating success? And why then? Why not 100,000 years earlier or 50,000 years later? What was different about that specific moment in time? If you're listening to this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. Maybe hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is. I love seeing that it's bedtime in Berlin, morning in Melbourne, midnight in Montreal, all at once. Over the next few hours, we're going to walk through this transformation step by step. We'll start in the before times, with anatomically modern humans who had all the hardware but somehow lacked the software. We'll meet the Neanderthals, the powerful, intelligent competitors who should have inherited the Earth instead of us. We'll watch as something sparks in the human mind, something that creates art and music and abstract thought. We'll follow early humans as they spread across the entire planet, adapting to every environment from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest. We'll see how we met the Neanderthals in Europe and what happened during those 10,000 years we lived side by side. And we'll explore the real secret to human success, which turns out to have almost nothing to do with individual intelligence and everything to do with something much more interesting. This isn't a story about humans being smarter or stronger or faster than other species, because we weren't. Neanderthals had bigger brains. Other human species were just as capable of survival. What made us different was something stranger and more subtle, something that wouldn't become obvious until you zoomed out and looked at the whole picture. 40,000 years ago, humans stood at a threshold. The path we crossed led to everything we have today. Cities and civilization, science and art, the entire modern world. But it also led to the extinction of every other human species, to the disappearance of the megafauna, to a level of planetary dominance no species had ever achieved. This is the story of humanity's takeover, the mystery of what changed in our minds, and the question of what it means to be human. Let's go back, way back, to the long wait before the spark. So here's the part of the story that doesn't make sense, and I mean really doesn't make sense. Because we have this idea that humans evolved from earlier species, and once we evolved into modern humans, we immediately started doing modern human things. Building, creating, innovating, dominating. That's the story we tell ourselves. Evolution equipped us with big brains, and then we used those big brains to take over the world. Except that's not what happened. Not even close. Anatomically modern humans, people who were physically identical to you and me, first appeared in Africa somewhere around 300,000 years ago. Maybe a bit earlier, maybe a bit later. The fossil record isn't perfect, but we've got skulls from Morocco, from Ethiopia, from South Africa, all dating back 250 to 300,000 years. And these aren't almost modern humans. These are modern humans. Same brain size, same body proportions, same bone structure. If one of them put on jeans and a t-shirt and walked past you on the street, you wouldn't look twice. So what were they doing for the next 250,000 years? Almost nothing. And when I say almost nothing, I'm not exaggerating. The archaeological record from this period is shockingly sparse, shockingly repetitive, shockingly conservative. These early modern humans made stone tools, yes, but the tools they made were basically the same tools their Homo erectus ancestors had been making for over 1 million years. Simple hand axes, crude choppers, basic flakes. The kind of tools you could teach someone to make in an afternoon. And they made these same tools, in the same way, for tens of thousands of years. A child born 100,000 years ago could look at their grandfather's stone tools and their great-great-great-grandfather's stone tools, going back 1,000 generations, and they'd all be virtually identical. There's no innovation, no improvement, no iteration. Just the same basic survival technology, repeated endlessly. Think about that for a moment. These people had the same cognitive capacity as Leonardo da Vinci, as Albert Einstein, as anyone who's ever lived. The same brain that would eventually invent writing and mathematics and send rockets to the moon. But for 100,000 years they made the same hand axe. Over and over and over. Where's the art? There isn't any. Not for most of this period. Where's the jewellery, the personal adornment, the signs of individual identity or status? Absent. Where's the long-distance trade that would indicate planning and social networks? Missing. Where are the elaborate burial practices that suggest belief in an afterlife or symbolic thought? Rare to non-existent for most of this period. We've got a few tantalizing hints from some sites. Blombos Cave in South Africa, dated to around 75,000 years ago, shows evidence of ochre processing. Patterns carved into chunks of red stone that might be decorative. There are shell beads that might have been strung together as jewellery. This is exciting, this is suggestive. But here's the thing, it appears and then it disappears. It's not continuous, it's not building on itself. It's like someone had an idea, tried it for a while, and then their grandchildren forgot about it. 100,000 years ago, modern humans were living in what is now Israel, at sites like Kafze and Skul. We've found their skeletons, we've found their tools. And the tools are Mousterian Middle Paleolithic technology, the same stuff Neanderthals were making in Europe. Not more advanced, not more sophisticated, just serviceable, basic, survival-level stoneworking. These people looked like us, but they weren't behaving like us, not yet. So what was missing? That's the question that drives archaeologists crazy. Because anatomically, neurologically, these people should have been capable of everything we're capable of. They had the hardware, the brain structure was there, the vocal anatomy for complex language was there, the manual dexterity for fine tool-making was there. But the software, the cultural operating system, the thing that would unlock all that potential, that was missing. Or maybe it was there but lying dormant, waiting for the right trigger. One theory is population density. Maybe you need a certain number of people living in close enough proximity for ideas to spread and build on each other. When populations are too small, too scattered, Innovation happens, but it doesn't stick. Someone invents something clever, but when they die, the knowledge dies with them. Their children might not learn it, or might not value it, or might not pass it on effectively. The invention disappears, and 20 generations later someone has to reinvent it from scratch. It's what anthropologists call the collective brain hypothesis. The idea that human intelligence isn't really about individual smarts, it's about accumulated cultural knowledge passed down and built upon across generations, and that only works when you have dense enough populations with good enough communication to sustain the transmission chain. Early modern humans lived in small, scattered groups, band sizes probably in the 20s to 40s, limited contact with other groups, high mortality rates. In those conditions, culture might have been too fragile to accumulate, every generation starting almost from zero. Another theory focuses on language. Maybe early modern humans didn't have full modern language yet. Oh, they could communicate, absolutely. They could coordinate hunts, share information about where food was, warn each other about dangers. But full modern language, the kind that can express abstract concepts, tell stories about things that happened in the past or might happen in the future, discuss ideas that have no physical form, that's different. That requires syntax, grammar, a huge vocabulary, the ability to nest ideas within ideas within ideas. Some researchers think this capacity evolved gradually, that early modern humans had proto-language, something more sophisticated than chimp communication, but less sophisticated than what we have now. And that full modern language, the kind that enables cumulative culture and abstract thought and symbolic reasoning, didn't emerge until much later. Maybe 60,000 years ago, maybe 50, maybe even later. We don't know. We can't know for sure because language doesn't fossilize. We can look at skull structure and infer things about vocal anatomy, but that doesn't tell us about grammar or vocabulary or conceptual frameworks. There's also a genetic hypothesis. Some researchers think there was an actual mutation, a genetic change that happened sometime after anatomically modern humans evolved. A change that affected brain wiring, that enabled new kinds of thinking. The FOXP2 gene gets mentioned a lot. It's involved in speech and language, and the modern human version is slightly different from the Neanderthal version. But honestly, the genetic evidence is murky. We've sequenced Neanderthal DNA now, and it turns out they had versions of the same genes we have. Their brains were built on the same basic blueprint, so if there was a magic mutation that made modern humans special, we haven't found it yet. What we do know, what the archaeological record shows us clearly, is that something changed. And it changed around 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, with the transformation becoming really obvious around 40,000 years ago. We start seeing evidence of behavioral modernity, not just anatomical modernity, but actual modern human behavior. Tools becoming more diverse, more specialized, different regions developing different tool styles, which means different groups were coming up with different solutions to the same problems. That's innovation. Materials moving long distances, shells from the coast showing up 100 miles inland, high-quality stone from specific quarries being traded across regions. That's planning and social networks. Composite tools appearing. Not just a rock you hold in your hand, but a carefully shaped stone blade hafted onto a wooden shaft with plant resin and sinew. That requires multiple steps, multiple materials, planning ahead to gather everything you need. That's executive function and delayed gratification. The capacity to work toward a future goal. And most tellingly, we start seeing hints of symbolic thought. Pieces of ochre carved with geometric patterns, shell beads that served no practical purpose except to look nice or signal something about the wearer. Burial practices becoming more elaborate in some populations. This is huge. This is evidence of people thinking about abstract concepts. Beauty, identity, status, the afterlife. Things you can't touch or eat or use to hunt with. Things that exist only in the mind. But here's what's really important to understand. This transformation wasn't sudden. It wasn't like someone flipped a switch and boom! Modern human behavior appeared everywhere all at once. It was gradual. It was patchy. It happened earlier in some places than others. Some populations showed signs of behavioral modernity that disappeared again. False starts. Experiments that didn't stick. The picture is messy and complicated, which is exactly what you'd expect from a real evolutionary process rather than a clean narrative. African sites show increasing sophistication starting around 70,000 years ago. Then there's a gap. Then it shows up again stronger around 50,000 years ago. Different regions show different timelines. This isn't a single revolution. It's a slow-building wave that took tens of thousands of years to gather momentum. And during all this time, humans weren't alone. The world was full of other human species, and that's what makes this story so interesting. Because we weren't expanding into empty territory. We were one player among many in a competitive landscape, and somehow we won. In Europe, Neanderthals had been thriving for 200,000 years, perfectly adapted to Ice Age conditions. In Asia, Denisovans occupied vast territories, their DNA showing up in modern populations from Siberia to Southeast Asia to Tibet. Homo erectus, the most successful human species before us, was still hanging on in parts of Indonesia. Maybe others we haven't discovered yet, other human species that existed alongside us. The world wasn't waiting for modern humans to show up, it was already occupied. For most of human evolution, there were multiple human species coexisting. This was normal. The weird thing, the unprecedented thing, is what we have now. One human species, just us. That's never happened before in the 7 million year history of hominins. There were always multiple species. And then 40,000 years ago, there was only us. So the question isn't just what changed in modern humans. The question is, why did that change allow us to replace everyone else? What did we have that Neanderthals with their bigger brains and superior strength didn't have? What advantage did we possess that allowed us to spread into every environment, every continent, every ecosystem, while our competitors disappeared? That's the mystery we're going to unravel. But first, we need to understand who we were up against. Because if you'd been a betting person 60,000 years ago, you wouldn't have put your money on us. Let's talk about the Neanderthals. Because if we're going to understand why modern humans took over 40,000 years ago, we need to understand who we were competing against. And the Neanderthals were, by any reasonable measure, a formidable opponent. Actually, formidable might be underselling it. In almost every physical category, they were superior to us. Stronger, tougher, better adapted to the environments they lived in. They'd been successfully surviving in Europe and Western Asia for 200,000 years before modern humans even showed up. 200,000 years. That's longer than modern humans have existed as a species. Picture yourself 60,000 years ago in what is now France. It's the Ice Age. Not the brief cold snap we sometimes call an ice age today, but the real deal. Massive glaciers covering Scandinavia, and the Alps, extending down into northern Europe. Average temperatures 10 to 15 degrees Celsius colder than today. Winters that last for months, brutal and unforgiving. This is Neanderthal territory, and the Neanderthals are perfectly built for it. First, let's talk about their bodies. Because when you look at Neanderthal skeletons, what strikes you immediately is the sheer robustness. These were not gracile, slender people. The bones are thick, dense, heavy. The muscle attachment points, the places where tendons connected muscle to bone, they're massive. Prominent, rugose, indicating muscles that were significantly larger and stronger than ours. Take an average Neanderthal male, and he probably stood about 5 feet 5 inches to 5 feet 7 inches tall. Not particularly tall by modern standards, but he'd weigh somewhere between 170 to 200 pounds, almost all of it muscle. His chest would be barrel-shaped, wider and deeper than a modern human's, housing lungs that could process the oxygen demands of that muscular body. His shoulders would be incredibly broad, his arms shorter and thicker than ours, with forearm bones that were curved and reinforced to handle tremendous stress. And here's the really striking part. Bone density measurements from Neanderthal remain show bones that are significantly denser than modern human bones. We're talking cortical bone thickness that's 30 to 40% greater in some elements. These were not just strong people. These were people whose skeletons were built like they expected to be doing heavy, dangerous physical work their entire lives. Because they were. The skull tells an interesting story too. Neanderthal skulls are larger than ours, with a distinctive shape. Where modern human skulls are tall and rounded, Neanderthal skulls are long and low. There's a prominent brow ridge, a projecting face, and most importantly a brain case that's actually bigger than ours. Let me repeat that. Neanderthal brains were larger than modern human brains. On average, a Neanderthal brain was about 1,350 to 1,700 cubic centimeters. The average modern human brain is about 1,350 cubic centimeters. They had more computing power than we do. More neurons, more processing capacity, more raw intelligence potential. Now, brain size isn't everything. We know that. Brain organization matters, the specific wiring, the connections between regions. But still, when you're comparing species, having a bigger brain is generally an advantage, and the Neanderthals had it. So if you're keeping score, they're stronger than us, tougher than us, and they've got bigger brains. What else? Oh, they were better adapted to cold. Their body proportions follow what's called Bergmann's rule and Allen's rule, ecological principles that predict how body shape responds to climate. In cold environments, you want a compact body with a high mass to surface area ratio, retains heat better. Short limbs, thick torso, reduced extremities. That's exactly what Neanderthals had. Their shorter, stockier build was perfect for conserving heat in Ice Age Europe. Modern humans, who evolved in tropical and subtropical Africa, have the opposite build. Longer limbs, more linear body proportions, better for shedding heat in hot climates. Put a modern human and a Neanderthal in Ice Age Europe, and the Neanderthal has a massive thermoregulatory advantage. Their nasal cavity was larger too, which probably helped warm and humidify the cold, dry air they were breathing. Some researchers think their larger noses also gave them an enhanced sense of smell, useful for tracking prey in forested environments. Even their eyes were slightly larger, possibly adapted for the lower light levels at higher latitudes during long winter months. Everything about Neanderthal anatomy screams optimized for Ice Age Europe. And it worked. For 200,000 years, it worked beautifully. So what were they doing during those 200 millennia? What was Neanderthal life actually like? We know quite a bit, actually, because Neanderthals left behind a rich archaeological record. They made sophisticated stone tools, primarily what archaeologists call the Mousterian industry. These weren't simple hand axes. These were carefully prepared cores that were struck in precise ways to produce standardized flakes. The levallois technique, it's called. You prepare a stone core by shaping it carefully, then strike it just right to produce a flake that's already the desired shape and size. It requires planning, understanding of stone mechanics, manual dexterity and skill. Neanderthals were expert stoneworkers. They used fire and used it well. Archaeological sites across Europe show hearths, fire pits, evidence of controlled burning going back hundreds of thousands of years. They were cooking their food, staying warm, possibly using fire to harden wooden spear points. They hunted large game. The animal bones found at Neanderthal sites tell us they were taking down reindeer, bison, wild horses, woolly rhinoceros, even occasionally mammoths. These were apex predators, highly competent hunters operating in dangerous, challenging environments. And here's where it gets really interesting. They cared for each other. We have evidence of this, physical evidence in the bones themselves. The most famous example comes from Shanidar Cave in Iraq. Shanidar I, as he's known, was an adult male Neanderthal who lived to be somewhere between 35 and 50 years old. That might not sound old, but for the Paleolithic, it was a decent lifespan. And this individual was severely disabled. His right arm had been damaged, possibly amputated years before his death. The bone shows degenerative changes consistent with long-term disability. He was blind in his left eye. He had significant injuries to his legs and feet. This man could not have hunted, could not have contributed to food, procurement in any normal way. He would have been dependent on others for survival, and yet he lived for years, possibly decades, with these disabilities. Someone fed him, someone protected him, someone cared for him when he couldn't care for himself. This is compassion. This is empathy. This is recognizing another individual's value beyond their immediate utility. It's one of the most human behaviors we can observe, and Neanderthals were doing it hundreds of thousands of years ago. They buried their dead. Not all the time, not in every population, but burial practices definitely existed. Sites across Europe and the Middle East have yielded Neanderthal skeletons in what appear to be deliberately dug graves, sometimes in fetal positions, sometimes with what might be grave goods, though this is debated. The mere act of burial suggests something profound. It suggests they recognized death as something significant, that the dead body deserved special treatment, that there was some concept, however primitive, of honoring the deceased. And here's something we've only discovered in the last couple of decades. They used pigments. Red and black manganese dioxide and ochre have been found at Neanderthal sites, sometimes in processed forms, ground into powder. What were they using it for? We don't know for sure. Body painting, decorating objects, symbolic marking. Whatever the purpose, the use of pigments suggests some level of symbolic thought, some appreciation for colour and visual representation beyond purely functional considerations. Some sites show evidence of what might be decorative items. Shells with holes drilled through them, possibly for stringing as beads or pendants. Eagle talons with cut marks suggesting they were removed deliberately, maybe for use as ornaments. In Spain, at a site called Cueva de los Aviones, researchers found shells and mineral pigments dated to over 115,000 years ago, before modern humans arrived in Europe. This is pushing back our understanding of Neanderthal cognitive capabilities significantly. Did they have language? This is the million-dollar question, and we don't have a definitive answer, but we have clues. The hyoid bone, a small bone in the throat that anchors muscles involved in speech, has been found in Neanderthal remains, and it looks just like ours. Their vocal tract anatomy, reconstructed from skull fossils, suggests they could produce a wide range of sounds. The FOXP2 gene, which we mentioned earlier as being involved in language, has been sequenced from Neanderthal DNA. They had a version very similar to ours. So anatomically, they seem to have had the equipment for speech. Whether they had full modern language with complex grammar and syntax, that's unknown. But they could certainly communicate in sophisticated ways. Think about what it takes to organize a hunt of large, dangerous prey. You need to coordinate multiple individuals, communicate a plan, adjust strategies based on the animal's behavior. You need to share knowledge about animal habits, seasonal patterns, where the herds migrate. You can do some of that with gestures and simple vocalizations, sure, but complex language would make it so much easier, and Neanderthals were successful hunters for hundreds of thousands of years, which suggests pretty sophisticated communication abilities. So here we have a species that's stronger than modern humans, has a bigger brain, is perfectly adapted to Ice Age Europe, makes sophisticated tools, controls fire, hunts dangerous game, cares for the injured and elderly, buries the dead, uses symbolic pigments, and probably has language. Why on earth didn't they inherit the planet? If you're a time traveller from the future going back 100,000 years ago, and you had to bet on which human species would dominate the Earth, you'd be a fool to bet on modern humans. Everything, and I mean everything, points to Neanderthals being the winning bet. They had a 200,000-year head start. They occupied prime real estate in Europe and Western Asia. They were tough, smart, adapted. By contrast, modern humans were tropical specialists not built for cold, still figuring out their identity in Africa, showing only sporadic signs of behavioural complexity. If this were a competition, Neanderthals were the favourites by a mile. And it wasn't just Neanderthals. The world was full of different human species, each one specialised for their environment, each one successful in their own way. In Asia, the Denisovans were thriving. We don't have many Denisovan fossils, just a few fragments from Denisova cave in Siberia, a jawbone from Tibet. But we have their DNA, and it tells a fascinating story. Denisovans were widespread across Asia, from Siberia to Southeast Asia to the Tibetan Plateau. They interbred with modern humans, and some populations today carry Denisovan DNA. Tibetans, for instance, have a gene variant from Denisovans that helps them cope with high altitude. Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians carry significant percentages of Denisovan ancestry. These were clearly successful, widespread populations. In Indonesia, on the island of Java, Homo erectus was still hanging on. Homo erectus, the species that had walked out of Africa nearly 2 million years ago and spread across the Old World. They'd survived ice ages and warm periods, adapted to forests and grasslands, persisted through countless climate shifts. They were the most successful human species in history, measured by longevity. Nearly 2 million years of existence, and they were still around when modern humans were just getting started. Some fossils from Java might be as recent as 50,000 years ago, though the dating is uncertain. There might have been others too. The Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits from the island of Flores in Indonesia, tiny humans standing only about 3.5 feet tall, persisted until at least 60,000 years ago, possibly later. They had small brains but made sophisticated stone tools and hunted the dwarf elephants that lived on their island. Adaptation comes in many forms. The point is, the world wasn't empty. Modern humans weren't expanding into vacant territory. Every major region was already occupied by human species that had been there for tens or hundreds of thousands of years. Species that were locally adapted, that knew the environment intimately, that had proven their ability to survive and thrive. And yet, by 30,000 years ago, all of them were gone. Every single one. Just us left. This is unprecedented in the history of human evolution. For millions of years, multiple human species coexisted. It was normal. The weird thing is the present situation, one species, globally distributed with no close relatives. That's never happened before. So what happened? How did modern humans, starting from Africa as just one population among many, manage to replace everyone else? You might think it was violence, that we were more warlike, more aggressive, that we exterminated our competitors through genocide, and maybe violence played a role. We'll get to that later. But it can't be the whole story because the archaeological evidence doesn't support widespread warfare. We don't find mass graves of Neanderthals killed by modern humans. We don't find fortifications or weapons specifically designed for human combat from this period. If anything, the evidence suggests these different species coexisted, at least for a while, in relative peace. You might think it was disease, that modern humans brought African diseases that Neanderthals had no immunity to, and epidemics wiped them out. Plausible, and this might have contributed. But diseases leave signatures in DNA, and when we sequence ancient Neanderthal genomes, we don't see evidence of pandemic-level die-offs from novel pathogens. Plus, diseases work both ways. Neanderthals had been living in Europe for 200,000 years. They'd have their own diseases that modern humans would have been vulnerable to. Climate change is another hypothesis. The period from 50,000 to 30,000 years ago saw significant climate fluctuations. Maybe Neanderthals, so perfectly adapted to Ice Age conditions, couldn't cope with rapid environmental shifts. Modern humans, being more generalist, more flexible, handled the changes better. This probably played a role. But Neanderthals had survived multiple climate cycles over their 200,000-year existence. They'd lived through warm periods and cold periods, glacial advances and retreats. Climate change alone seems insufficient to explain why they disappeared specifically when modern humans showed up. Here's the thing that makes this mystery so compelling. Neanderthals had almost every advantage. Better adapted to the local environment, check. Physically superior, check. Bigger brains, check. Established populations with intimate knowledge of the landscape and resources, check. 200,000 years of successful survival, check. They should have won, and yet they didn't. Which means modern humans must have had some advantage that was more important than all of those things combined. Something that wasn't obvious from looking at skeletons or measuring brain size. Something subtle but absolutely critical. And whatever that advantage was, it allowed modern humans to spread from Africa to Asia, to Australia, to Europe, to eventually the Americas and every remote island in between. To adapt to rainforests and deserts and tundra and mountains and coasts. To thrive in every ecosystem on Earth while Neanderthals, perfectly designed for Ice Age Europe, vanished. The answer, as we'll see, has less to do with individual capabilities and more to do with something that's harder to measure in the fossil record. Something social, something cultural, something about how modern humans work together, shared information, built on each other's ideas. But before we get there, we need to understand what sparked the transformation in the first place. What changed in modern humans between 100,000 years ago and 40,000 years ago? What woke up? Something was changing. You couldn't see it all at once, couldn't point to a specific year or decade and say, there, that's when it happened. But if you could watch human populations across Africa over a span of 30,000 years, from 70,000 years ago to 40,000 years ago, you'd see patterns shifting, behaviours appearing that hadn't been there before, technologies emerging that required new ways of thinking. It was gradual, patchy, uneven, but it was real. The spark was catching. Let's start around 70,000 years ago in southern Africa. Archaeological sites from this period start showing something new, not everywhere, not all the time, but frequently enough that it can't be ignored. At Pinnacle Point, a series of caves on the southern coast of what is now South Africa, people were doing something their ancestors hadn't done. They were exploiting marine resources systematically, gathering shellfish, harvesting seals, fishing. This might not sound revolutionary, but think about what it requires. You need to understand tidal patterns, know when low tide exposes the best gathering spots. You need to know which shellfish are safe to eat and which are toxic. You need tools to pry limpets and mussels off rocks. You need to plan your activities around the moon cycle because tides follow the moon. This is specialized knowledge, environmental understanding, and it's being transmitted from generation to generation. Someone figured out that you can eat those shells, that you gather them at low tide, that you avoid them during certain seasons when they're toxic. And then they taught their children, who taught their children, and the knowledge stuck. That's different from what came before. That's cultural accumulation. At Sibudu, cave, also in South Africa, dating to around 77,000 years ago, archaeologists found something even more intriguing. Composite tools. Not just a stone you hold in your hand, but carefully crafted stone points that had been hafted, attached to wooden shafts with plant resin adhesive. Making these tools required multiple steps spread over time. First, collect the right kind of stone. Second, shape it into a point using careful flaking techniques. Third, gather specific plants and heat them to extract sticky resin. Fourth, prepare a wooden shaft. Fifth, attach the point to the shaft using the resin and probably cordage made from plant fibers. This isn't just tool use. This is planning. This is understanding that you need to gather materials today for a tool you'll use tomorrow or next week. This is delayed gratification, executive function, the ability to hold a future goal in your mind and work toward it through multiple intermediate steps. The tools themselves are also more specialized. Instead of one general-purpose hand axe, you're starting to see different tools for different jobs. Small, sharp blades for cutting, scrapers for working hides, points for spears, each one designed for a specific task. This is the beginning of technological diversification. And here's what's really interesting. Different sites from this period show different tool styles. The tools found in South Africa don't look exactly like the tools from East Africa, which don't look exactly like the tools from North Africa. There's regional variation, and regional variation means innovation. It means different groups are solving the same problems in different ways, coming up with their own solutions, developing their own traditions. That's the signature of creativity, of flexible thinking. If everyone was just copying ancient patterns passed down unchanging from generation to generation, all the tools would look the same everywhere. But they don't. Each region has its own flavor, its own style. Someone is experimenting, trying new approaches, and those innovations are spreading within their group but not to other groups. You're getting cultural diversity, the beginning of different human populations developing different identities. But here's the frustrating part. This sophistication appears and then it fades. The archaeological record from this period is maddeningly inconsistent. You'll see evidence of complex behavior at one site, dated to 75,000 years ago. Then nothing for the next 10,000 years. Then it shows up again at a different site at 60,000 years ago, then disappears again. It's like waves building and crashing. The tide is coming in, but it's not a smooth, steady rise. It's fits and starts, innovations appearing and vanishing, knowledge gained and lost. Why? What's going on? One possibility is population size. Maybe these bursts of innovation happened when local populations reached a critical density. Enough people living close enough together that ideas could spread, that innovations could be shared and improved upon. But then something happens, a drought, a disease, a local environmental collapse, and the population crashes. Drops back down below the critical threshold. The innovations don't disappear entirely, but without enough people to sustain them, to keep teaching them, to keep refining them, they fade. The next generation still knows how to make them, but barely. The generation after that has forgotten half the steps. 3 generations later, it's lost, and people go back to simpler technologies that don't require as much specialized knowledge. Then the population grows again, density increases, and innovation starts building again. Wash, rinse, repeat. This pattern, innovation followed by regression, is exactly what you'd expect if culture is fragile, if it depends on having enough people in enough contact to maintain the transmission chain. And for most of human history, populations were small and scattered. Even a minor population crash could break the chain. Another theory focuses on climate, and the climate during this period was anything but stable. Around 74,000 years ago, Mount Toba in Indonesia erupted in one of the largest volcanic explosions in the last 2 million years. It ejected something like 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the atmosphere. For context, that's about 5,000 times larger than the Mount St. Helens eruption. The ash cloud would have circled the globe, blocking sunlight, cooling temperatures, disrupting weather patterns for years. Some researchers think this eruption created a volcanic winter that nearly wiped out humanity. The genetic evidence shows that modern human populations went through a bottleneck sometime around this period, a dramatic reduction in population size. Maybe down to as few as 10,000 individuals worldwide. 10,000. That's the population of a small town, the entire human species reduced to that. If that's true, and the dating is uncertain so it's debated, but if it's true, then most of the cultural knowledge, most of the innovations, most of the accumulated wisdom of earlier populations would have been lost. The survivors would have been scattered, isolated, just trying to stay alive. Culture would have crashed along with the population. It would take thousands of years to rebuild, to climb back up to the level of sophistication that existed before. But even after Toba, even after the bottleneck if there was one, something was different. Because when innovation started appearing again, it appeared stronger, more persistent, more widespread. By 60,000 years ago, the archaeological record shows increasingly consistent evidence of behavioural modernity, not just in one site, but across multiple sites in Africa. Tools are getting more sophisticated. Microliths start appearing, tiny stone blades that could be set into wood or bone to create composite tools with sharp, replaceable edges. This is advanced technology. This is efficiency. Instead of making a whole new tool when the edge gets dull, you just pop out the microlith and replace it with a fresh one. The handle, the backing, the framework, all that stays the same. You're optimizing, thinking about resource use, planning for maintenance and repair. Bone tools become more common, not just using bone opportunistically but deliberately shaping it, creating needles, awls, points. Bone is harder to work than stone in some ways, requires different techniques. The fact that people are bothering to work bone suggests they're solving specific problems that stone can't solve. Maybe they need needles for sewing tailored clothing. Maybe they need fishing hooks or harpoons. Each new material, each new technique is a solution to a problem, and the diversity of solutions is expanding. Long-distance movement of materials is becoming more obvious too. Obsidian, a volcanic glass that's excellent for making sharp tools, is showing up at sites that are hundreds of kilometers from the nearest obsidian source. Someone is moving these materials. Either groups are traveling farther, or they're trading with other groups. Either way, it suggests social networks extending beyond the immediate band. It suggests relationships between groups, interactions, exchange systems. This is important because it means information can flow. If Group A figures out a better way to make fishing spears and they're in contact with Group B can learn that technique. Group B then improves on it and passes the improvement to Group C. Ideas are starting to spread horizontally across populations, not just vertically from parent to child. This is the beginning of collective intelligence, the network effect. The more people connected, the more ideas flowing, the faster innovation happens. And once that process starts, it's self-reinforcing. Better tools allow for more efficient resource extraction. More resources support larger populations. Larger populations generate more innovations. More innovations spread through the network. The network grows. The cycle accelerates. So what actually changed? What was the spark that lit this fire? Here's the honest answer. We don't know for sure. We have theories, and the theories aren't mutually exclusive. Maybe multiple things changed at once, each one reinforcing the others. The language hypothesis is compelling. Maybe full modern language, the kind with complex syntax and grammar and the ability to express abstract concepts, evolved during this period. There's a huge difference between being able to say, mammoth by river, and being able to say 3 days ago I saw a mammoth herd migrating north along the river valley. They usually pass through around this time of year. If we prepare now, we can intercept them at the narrow pass where they'll have to cross the stream. We'll need at least 8 hunters with spears. Last time we tried this with fewer people, the mammoth charged and someone got hurt, so we need to plan carefully. One is a simple information transfer. The other is storytelling, planning, conditional reasoning, learning from past experience, coordinating future action. Modern language enables all of that. It allows you to share knowledge not just about the present, but about the past and the future. To discuss things that aren't physically present. To teach complex, multi-step processes by explaining each step verbally. To pass on accumulated wisdom, not just by demonstration, but through stories and instruction. And here's the thing about language and culture. They're mutually reinforcing. Language enables culture, and culture drives language development. The more complex your culture, the more you need sophisticated language to transmit it. The more sophisticated your language, the more complex a culture you can build. It's a positive feedback loop. Some researchers think there might have been a genetic change, a mutation that affected brain wiring in ways that enabled modern language. The FOXP2 gene gets mentioned a lot. It's involved in the fine motor control needed for speech and in language acquisition. Modern humans have a specific variant of this gene that's slightly different from what other primates have. Interestingly, Neanderthals had a version of FOXP2 that was very similar to ours, which suggests they might have had language capability too. But maybe modern humans had some other change, something we haven't identified yet, that gave us an edge. Or maybe there was no mutation at all. Maybe the capacity for full modern language was always there, latent in the modern human brain, just waiting for the right social and environmental conditions to activate it. Maybe you need a certain population density, a certain level of social interaction, before full language becomes necessary and therefore develops. The cultural capacity theory argues that it's not about genetics at all. It's about culture reaching a critical mass. Once a population accumulates enough knowledge, enough different innovations and techniques and traditions, culture itself becomes more robust. It's harder to lose everything when you have more things. If you know 50 different edible plants and you forget 5 of them, you've still got 45. But if you only know 10 and you forget 5, you've lost half your knowledge base. The more cultural knowledge a population has, the more resilient that knowledge becomes. And once you cross a certain threshold, culture starts building on itself faster than it can be lost. Each generation adds more than it forgets. Knowledge accumulates, technology advances, social complexity increases, you've achieved cultural takeoff. And maybe that's what happened around 70 to 50,000 years ago. Human populations finally accumulated enough cultural knowledge to cross the critical threshold, and boom, the process became self-sustaining. Population density is part of this too. Larger populations mean more chances for someone to have a brilliant idea. More innovations appearing per generation just by random chance. If you have a band of 20 people, and one person in every 1,000 is a natural innovator, you might go 50 generations without anyone coming up with a new idea. But if you have a population of 10,000 people in contact with each other, you've got 10 innovators at any given time. 10 people trying new things, experimenting, solving problems creatively. The innovations spread through the network, get refined, get combined with other innovations. The more people, the faster things progress. So maybe what changed wasn't anything inside individual human brains. Maybe what changed was that populations grew large enough and interconnected enough that collective intelligence could finally operate at scale. This would also explain why the transformation was gradual and patchy. Because populations were growing unevenly, climate was fluctuating. Some regions crossed the critical threshold earlier than others. Africa seems to have led the way because that's where modern humans evolved, where populations were largest and most diverse. But even in Africa, it took tens of thousands of years for the transformation to fully take hold. Climate stress might have played a role too. When environments are stable and resources are predictable, there's less pressure to innovate. Why change what works? But when climate is fluctuating, when droughts are becoming more frequent, when animal migrations are shifting, suddenly the old ways don't work anymore. You're forced to adapt or die. And adaptation drives innovation. Some groups figure out new hunting techniques or find new food sources or develop better tools. The groups that innovate successfully survive, the ones that don't disappear. Natural selection operating on cultural traits, not just genetic ones. And the period from 70,000 to 40,000 years ago was climatically turbulent. Rapid oscillations between warm and cold, wet and dry. Populations that were flexible, that could innovate and adapt quickly, had an advantage. Maybe that's what selected for behavioral modernity. The groups that were most innovative, most flexible, most capable of cultural change, those were the ones that survived and expanded. The ones still relying on old conservative traditions got left behind. Here's what we can say with confidence. By around 50,000 years ago, definitely by 40,000 years ago, something had fundamentally changed in human populations. The archaeological signature is unmistakable. Tools are diverse and sophisticated. Art is appearing. Long-distance trade networks exist. Regional cultural diversity is established. People are exploiting a wider range of food sources, adapting to different environments, showing evidence of symbolic thought and abstract reasoning. The transformation is complete. Humans have become behaviorally modern, not just anatomically modern, but thinking and acting in ways that are recognizably human to us today. And once that transformation happened, once the spark caught and the fire started spreading, there was no stopping it. Because humans with modern behavior had something that no other species on Earth had ever possessed. The ability to accumulate knowledge across generations, to build on what came before, to share innovations across populations, to adapt culturally faster than genes could evolve. We became, for the first time, a species whose evolution was driven more by culture than by biology. And that changed everything. The Neanderthals were strong and smart and well adapted. But they were constrained by biology. Their success depended on their physical capabilities, their individual intelligence. Modern humans had discovered a different path to success: collective intelligence, cultural evolution. The ability to not just use our brains individually, but to link them together into networks that could solve problems no individual could solve alone. That was the advantage. That was the spark. And once it ignited, it was only a matter of time before modern humans spread across the entire planet, transforming every environment they encountered, becoming the most successful large mammal Earth has ever seen. But the transformation wasn't just intellectual. It was expressed in ways that are still beautiful 40,000 years later. It was expressed in art. You're holding that torch again, standing in the cave in southern France 40,000 years ago. The ochre paste is ready. You've mixed it carefully, ground the red stone until it's powder, added animal fat and water until the consistency is perfect. Your fingers are stained deep red. Behind you, other members of your band are watching. Some of them helped gather the materials. Others helped prepare the cave, clearing away debris, positioning stones to stand on so you can reach the higher sections of the wall. This isn't just one person's project, this is something the whole group cares about. You raise your hand to the wall and begin. A sweeping curve that will become a horse's back. Another line for the neck, the head taking shape, ears, muzzle. You're not just making marks, you're creating something beautiful. Something that will last longer than you can possibly imagine. The artistic explosion that happened around 45,000 to 35,000 years ago is one of the most striking transformations in the archaeological record. And I mean striking in the literal sense. You can see it. You can look at cave paintings from this period, and they take your breath away. These aren't primitive scribbles. These aren't crude stick figures or simple handprints. This is sophisticated, accomplished, stunning art created by people who understood proportion, perspective, shading, movement. People who were looking at the world with the same aesthetic sense we have today. Chauvet Cave in southern France contains some of the oldest cave paintings we've discovered. The oldest images date to around 32,000 years ago. When researchers first explored this cave in the late 20th century, they were shocked by the sophistication of what they found. Horses rendered with such precision you can see muscle definition in their flanks. Lions prowling, their bodies in perfect proportion, their movement captured with fluid, confident lines. A panel showing rhinoceroses, their horns, their distinctive profiles, their posture suggesting they're about to charge. The artists used the natural contours of the cave wall to give the animals three-dimensional form. A bulge in the rock becomes a shoulder, a depression suggests depth. They understood perspective, showing herds of animals with some in the foreground larger and more detailed, others in the background smaller and sketchier, creating the illusion of distance. They used shading techniques, blowing charcoal powder through hollow bones to create soft gradations of colour, suggesting shadow and volume, scraping away the darker surface of the cave wall to reveal lighter stone underneath, creating highlights, mixing different pigments to get different shades of red, brown, ochre, black. Some panels show animals that have clearly been drawn and redrawn over time, but not randomly, deliberately. Certain animals layered on top of others, in ways that create narrative, that suggest sequence or relationship. A lion pride hunting, a mammoth herd migrating. These artists weren't just recording what they saw, they were telling stories, and they were doing it with technical mastery that wouldn't be surpassed for tens of thousands of years. When Picasso visited the cave paintings at Lascaux, he reportedly said, "We have invented nothing." He recognized the sophistication. the understanding of form and movement and composition. The person who painted the horses at Chauvet Cave 32,000 years ago would understand a Picasso. They were thinking the same thoughts, seeing beauty the same way, expressing themselves through art with the same fundamental human drive to create. And Chauvet isn't unique. Cave art from this period shows up across Europe. Lascaux in France dated to around 17,000 years ago, slightly later but equally stunning. Altamira in Spain, El Castillo, dozens of caves, hundreds of images, horses, bison, aurochs, deer, mammoths, lions, bears, rhinoceroses. The animals of the Ice Age rendered with love and precision and skill, but also abstract symbols, geometric patterns, dots, lines, grids. What do they mean? We don't know. Maybe they're calendars, tracking seasons, or animal migrations. Maybe they're maps of the landscape or the night sky. Maybe they're symbolic, representing concepts or stories or spiritual beliefs we can't access anymore. Whatever they meant to the people who made them, they represent abstract thought, the ability to reduce an idea to a symbol, to use visual representation to convey meaning beyond the literal. That's a cognitive leap. That's modern human thinking, and it's not just on cave walls. Portable art starts appearing everywhere in the archaeological record. Small carved figures made from bone, ivory, stone, antler. The Venus figurines, they're called, though that's a modern name and probably has nothing to do with how the people who made them thought about them. These are small sculptures, usually between 5 and 20 centimeters tall, depicting human figures, almost always female, usually with exaggerated sexual characteristics. Large breasts, wide hips, prominent bellies. Some have detailed facial features, others have featureless faces but elaborate hairstyles carved in intricate detail. The Venus of Willendorf, found in Austria and dated to around 28,000 years ago, is one of the most famous. She's carved from limestone and painted with red ochre. About 11 centimeters tall, she fits in the palm of your hand. Portable, personal. Someone made her, someone carried her, someone valued her enough to keep her. Was she a fertility symbol? A representation of a goddess or important woman? A teaching tool for midwives? A good luck charm? We don't know. But she was important enough that someone spent hours, days maybe, carefully carving her from stone, getting every detail right. These figurines have been found across an enormous geographic range, from France to Siberia, from Germany to Italy. Different styles, different materials, but the same basic concept. Someone, somewhere, had the idea to carve a human figure in 3 dimensions. And that idea spread, was adopted by different cultures, adapted to local styles and preferences. This is cultural diffusion. This is ideas travelling between populations, being shared, being modified, being passed on. And the fact that it's happening across such vast distances tells you that human groups were in contact, were communicating, were influencing each other. Tools were getting more sophisticated too, in ways that show real innovation, real problem solving. Blade technology appears and spreads during this period. Earlier stone tools were made by striking flakes off a core. Each flake was used as a tool, simple, effective, but wasteful of good stone. Blade technology is different. You prepare a core very carefully, shaping it into a specific form. Then you strike it in a precise way to produce long, thin blades. Each blade has 2 sharp edges running its length. From a single stone core, you can produce dozens of blades. The total cutting edge you get from blade technology is 20 to 50 times greater than what you'd get from earlier flaking techniques. That's efficiency. That's maximizing your resources. And once you have these standardized blades, you can use them in different ways. Break them into smaller pieces to make composite tools. Attach them to wooden or bone handles to make knives. Set multiple small blades into a wooden shaft to create a saw. The versatility is extraordinary. Different tools for different jobs, and the specialization keeps increasing. By 40,000 years ago, archaeological sites are showing toolkits with 20, 30, 40 different specialized implements. Scrapers specifically designed for working leather, with a particular edge angle that works best for removing fat and tissue from hides. Burins, which are like chisels, for carving bone and antler and ivory. Drills for making holes in shell or bone or even stone. Needles, actual needles with eyes, made from bone, polished smooth, thin enough to pass through tailored clothing. The existence of needles tells you people were sewing, not just draping animal skins over their shoulders, but creating fitted garments, pants, tunics, boots, clothes designed for the body, designed for movement, designed to actually keep you warm in Ice Age conditions. Weapons were advancing too. The atlatl, or spear thrower, appears in the archaeological record during this period. It's a simple device, really, a stick with a hook on one end. You rest your spear against the hook, then use the atlatl to extend the length of your arm, increasing the leverage and therefore the speed and force with which you can throw the spear. Physics. Humans figuring out that a longer lever means more power. An atlatl can double or triple the distance and force of a spear throw. This is a game changer for hunting. You can take down large animals from a safer distance. You can hunt animals that are too fast or too dangerous to approach closely, and it spreads rapidly across different populations because it works, because everyone who sees it understands the advantage. Later, much later, the bow and arrow will appear. The very first evidence of bows might date to this period, though the earliest definitive evidence is slightly later, around 20,000 years ago. But the trajectory is clear. Weapons are becoming more sophisticated, more efficient, more deadly. Humans are becoming apex predators in a way no species had been before. And it's not just the tools themselves, it's the variety. Different regions are developing different tool traditions. The Ornithian culture, named after a site in France, is the archaeological culture associated with early modern humans in Europe, between 43,000 and 26,000 years ago. They have a distinctive set of tools and art objects that archaeologists can recognize and track across sites. But at the same time, other regions have their own cultures, their own styles. The Gravettian culture, which follows and partially overlaps with the Ornithian, has different tool forms, different artistic traditions. Eastern Europe develops its own distinct patterns. The Middle East has yet another set of regional variations. This diversity is important. It means different populations are innovating independently, solving problems in different ways, developing their own cultural identities. They're not all copying some single ancestral tradition. They're experimenting, creating, adapting. And that means cultural evolution is happening, different ideas being tried, successful ones spreading, unsuccessful ones being abandoned. It's variation and selection operating on culture, just like it operates on genes, but much, much faster. Jewellery and personal adornment become common during this period. Shell beads have been found at sites across Europe, Africa and Asia, often hundreds of kilometres from the nearest coast. Someone is trading these shells, or travelling long distances to acquire them. The beads are carefully shaped, pierced with small holes for stringing, sometimes polished or decorated. They're worn as necklaces, bracelets, sewn onto clothing. Why? Because they're beautiful. Because they signal something about the wearer. Status, identity, group affiliation. The patterns in which beads are arranged can be quite complex. Some burials show bodies adorned with thousands of beads, sewn into elaborate patterns on clothing that has long since decayed. We know the patterns existed because the beads are still there, fallen flat but retaining their arrangement. You can reconstruct where the clothing was, how it was decorated, how much labour went into creating it. This is people expressing themselves. This is fashion, aesthetics, individuality. These aren't just surviving. They're living. They're making choices about how to present themselves to the world. They're creating beauty for its own sake. Burial practices become increasingly elaborate during this period, and that tells us something profound about how these people thought about death, about the individual, about what happens after life ends. Earlier human burials were simple. A body placed in a pit may be covered with soil or rocks. But by 40,000 years ago, some burials are showing grave goods, objects deliberately placed with the deceased. Tools, weapons, jewellery, food offerings, even flowers based on pollen analysis from some sites. The famous Shanidar Cave Neanderthal burial, which we mentioned earlier, had evidence of flowers, though that interpretation is debated. But for modern humans during this period, grave goods are definitive and becoming increasingly common. Some burials show bodies positioned carefully, in fetal positions or lying in specific orientations. Some are covered with ochre, the whole body painted red. Why? Ochre is precious, takes effort to gather and process. Using it to cover a corpse that's about to be buried is expensive. It's a ritual expenditure of valuable resources. It means the community valued this individual enough to give them a send-off that cost real labour, real materials, and it suggests belief in something beyond death. Why decorate a body if you think that's the end? Why give them tools and food if they're not going somewhere? They might need those things? We can't know what these people believed, can't reconstruct their spiritual or religious ideas with any certainty. But we can see that they believed something, that death was meaningful enough to mark with ceremony, that individuals were important enough to honour, that there was some concept, however they understood it, of continuity beyond physical death. Music appears in the archaeological record too, and this might be my favourite development because it's so purely human. Bone flutes have been found at several sites in Europe dating to around 40,000 years ago. These aren't simple whistles. These are actual instruments with multiple finger holes, capable of producing different notes, different scales. Someone was playing melodies. Someone was making music. The oldest complete flute we've found is from Geissenklösterle cave in Germany, dated to around 42,000 years ago. It's made from a vulture wing bone, carefully hollowed and polished, with 5 finger holes precisely placed. When researchers created a replica and played it, it produced a pentatonic scale, clear, resonant notes, music that would sound familiar to us today. Imagine sitting around a fire 40,000 years ago, the day's hunting done, meat roasting, your band gathered in the flickering light. Someone picks up a flute and begins to play. A simple melody, maybe one everyone knows, maybe one they're making up as they go. Others join in, singing, humming, clapping out a rhythm. Children dancing. This is community. This is art for the sake of art. Music for the sake of music. Not survival, not utility, just humans being human, creating beauty, sharing joy, expressing emotions that have no words. All of these innovations, art and tools and music and burial and adornment, they're not separate developments, they're connected. They're all expressions of the same cognitive transformation, the ability to think symbolically, to represent one thing with another thing. A carved figure represents a person, a cave painting represents an animal, a musical note represents an emotion or an idea. Beads represent status or identity. Grave goods represent beliefs about death and afterlife, symbols upon symbols, meanings layered on meanings. And the ability to think symbolically is what enables complex language, abstract reasoning, planning for the future, understanding cause and effect at multiple levels of remove. It's what makes us human in the fullest sense. And during this period, between 45,000 and 35,000 years ago, it blossomed. The archaeological record explodes with evidence of symbolic thought. Not just 1 or 2 examples, but hundreds, thousands of artifacts showing people thinking in these new ways. The transformation is complete. Humans are fully behaviourally modern, and they're not staying in one place, they're spreading, moving into new territories, adapting to new environments, bringing their innovations with them and developing new ones as they go. Because here's the thing about cultural evolution. Once it starts, it accelerates. Each innovation makes the next one easier. Each tool enables the creation of better tools. Each idea sparks more ideas. The collective knowledge base grows, and as it grows, the pace of innovation increases. You get compound interest but for culture. And modern humans, with their symbolic thinking and their language and their art and their social networks, they were compounding faster than any species ever had. They didn't just make tools to survive. They made beautiful things for no practical reason except that they wanted to. They didn't just communicate information. They told stories, sang songs, created myths. They didn't just live. They thought about why they were living, what it meant, what happened after death. They weren't just surviving in the environment. They were transforming it, shaping it, making it theirs. And they were doing all of this together, not as isolated individuals, but as communities, as networks, as cultures that shared knowledge and built on each other's discoveries. The person who painted the horses at Chauvet Cave learned techniques from their elders, techniques that had been refined over generations, and they added their own innovations, their own style, their own vision, and the next generation of artists learned from them, knowledge accumulating, skills improving, art becoming more sophisticated with each iteration. That's cultural evolution. That's the human advantage. Not individual genius, though certainly there were brilliant individuals, but the ability to pull knowledge across people and across time, to learn from everyone who came before, to add your own contribution and pass it forward, to stand on the shoulders of giants, even if those giants were your great-great-grandmother who figured out a better way to carve bone or mix pigments. The Neanderthals made art too, we should note. Recent discoveries have shown that Neanderthals were using pigments, creating abstract symbols, maybe even painting on cave walls earlier than we thought. This is important. It means Neanderthals were also capable of symbolic thought, also had the cognitive capacity for art and abstract reasoning. So why did we succeed and they didn't? That's the question we keep coming back to. And the answer, as we're starting to see, has less to do with individual capacity and more to do with social systems, with how ideas spread, with network effects and cultural evolution. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand why modern humans won, we need to follow them as they exploded out of Africa and spread across the entire planet, bringing their innovations with them, adapting to every environment Earth could throw at them, becoming the most successful large mammal in the history of the planet. The takeover was beginning. Picture yourself standing on a beach in East Africa, maybe 70,000 years ago. The sun is setting over the Indian Ocean, painting the sky orange and red. Your band has been following the coastline for weeks, moving north, always north. You're not running from anything. You're just following the food, the shellfish beds, the seals that haul up on rocky shores. But you've travelled farther than your parents ever did, farther than their parents before them. You don't know it yet, but your great-great-grandchildren, 100 generations from now, will be living on the other side of the world, in places you can't even imagine. Rainforests where it rains every single day, frozen tundra where the sun disappears for months at a time, islands surrounded by endless ocean, deserts so dry that years pass between rains. Your descendants will adapt to all of it, will thrive in all of it. Because what your species has figured out, what makes you different from every other human species that's ever existed, is that you don't adapt through biology anymore. You adapt through culture, through innovation, through the collective knowledge passed down and built upon, and that means you can live anywhere. The great human migration out of Africa is one of the most remarkable stories in our species' history. Not because it was planned or coordinated. Nobody woke up one morning and decided to conquer the world. It happened gradually, almost accidentally, over tens of thousands of years. But the result was total global dominance. By 30,000 years ago, modern humans had spread to every continent except Antarctica, every major landmass on Earth, and we'd done it faster than any large mammal species ever had. The traditional narrative talks about modern humans leaving Africa in a single great wave, spreading rapidly across Asia and Europe. But the reality is more complex, more interesting. There were multiple migrations, multiple routes, populations moving in different directions at different times, meeting and mixing and separating. The genetic evidence, both from ancient DNA and from living populations, shows that different groups left Africa at different times. Some went east along the southern coasts of Asia. Some went north into the Middle East and then split. Some heading into Europe, others continuing east through Central Asia. Later groups followed different paths, overlaying earlier migrations, interbreeding with populations they encountered. It's messy. It's complicated. But the overall pattern is clear. Humans were moving, spreading, occupying new territories, and they were doing it successfully. The earliest migration we can track with confidence is the southern coastal route. Sometime around 70 to 60,000 years ago, groups of modern humans left East Africa, moved along the coastlines of the Arabian Peninsula, across what is now Iran and Pakistan and India, following the shores all the way to Southeast Asia and beyond. Why the coast? Because if you're a tropical adapted species with limited technology, the coast is a relatively easy environment. The temperature is moderated by the ocean. Food is abundant and reliable. Shellfish, fish, seabirds, seals, crabs. The resources are similar everywhere, so the knowledge that works in one coastal area mostly transfers to the next. You don't need to completely relearn your environment every time you move. And during glacial periods, when sea levels were much lower than today, the coastlines were different. Land bridges existed that are now underwater. The journey would have been easier in some ways, different coastlines exposed, different islands accessible. The evidence for this coastal migration is largely underwater now, drowned by rising seas at the end of the last ice age. But we can infer it from the genetic signatures of modern populations. The indigenous people of the Andaman Islands, off the coast of India, show genetic lineages that split from other human populations extremely early. The Aboriginal Australians and New Guineans show similar patterns. These are populations that descended from those early coastal migrants, and their genes tell a story of people moving quickly along shorelines, island hopping when necessary, reaching extremely distant locations faster than anyone expected. And here's where it gets really interesting. Humans reached Australia by at least 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier. Archaeological sites in northern Australia, places like Majid Beeb Rock Shelter, show evidence of human occupation dating back that far. Stone tools, ochre, the remains of fires, people were definitely there. But here's the thing, to reach Australia from mainland Asia, even with lowered sea levels, you have to cross open ocean. The Wallace Line, named after the naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, marks a deep water boundary that separates Asian and Australian fauna. Even during glacial maxima, when sea levels were 120 metres lower than today, there was always open ocean between the two continental shelves. Islands you could see from each other, yes, but water in between, deep water. Water that required boats to cross, not rafts, not accidentally drifting on floating debris. Boats, real constructed watercraft capable of carrying multiple people and their supplies across dozens of kilometres of open ocean. Think about what that means. 65,000 years ago, before modern humans had spread to Europe, before we have any evidence of art or sophisticated toolkits in most places, people were building boats capable of ocean crossings. They were planning expeditions to islands they could see in the distance. They were organising groups, gathering supplies, navigating across water without any landmarks to guide them, once land disappeared behind them. This is advanced cognitive ability. This is planning, cooperation, technology, risk assessment, and they succeeded. Made the crossing, established populations, and those populations thrived. The Aboriginal Australians are the oldest continuous culture on Earth. 65,000 years of unbroken occupation, unbroken cultural transmission. When Europeans arrived in Australia in the 18th century, they encountered hundreds of distinct Aboriginal groups, each with their own languages, their own territories, their own cultural traditions, but all descended from those first arrivals who made the ocean crossing tens of thousands of years earlier. And Australia, once you're there, is not an easy place to live. It's massive, it's diverse. Tropical rainforests in the north, vast deserts in the interior, temperate forests in the south, each environment requiring different adaptations, different knowledge, different survival strategies. The early Australians figured it all out. They learned which plants were edible in each region, and Australia has a lot of toxic plants that require elaborate processing before they're safe to eat. Some seeds need to be ground, leached in water for days, then roasted before the toxins break down. That's complex, multi-step knowledge that has to be learned and passed on precisely. They developed fire stick farming, deliberately burning sections of landscape to encourage new growth, to attract game animals, to manage the environment. They created some of the most sophisticated tracking skills ever developed, reading subtle signs in sand and vegetation to follow animals across vast distances. They invented the boomerang, a hunting tool so cleverly designed that it returns to the thrower if it misses its target. Aerodynamics, physics. Someone figured out the exact shape and weight distribution needed to make it work, and they encountered animals that had never seen humans before. Australia's megafauna, giant kangaroos standing 3 meters tall, Diprotodon, a marsupial the size of a rhinoceros, Megalania, a monitor lizard 7 meters long, possibly venomous, Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion, one of the most specialized carnivores ever evolved. These animals had no fear of humans initially. Why would they? Humans weren't part of their evolutionary experience, but within a few thousand years of human arrival, most of Australia's megafauna went extinct. This is a pattern we'll see repeated across the world. Humans arrive in a new place. The big animals disappear. Is it hunting? Climate change? Disease? Probably all three, but hunting was certainly a factor. Humans were effective predators, and animals with no evolutionary experience of human hunting had no defenses against it. They didn't run when they should have, didn't recognize human behavior as threatening until it was too late. The overkill hypothesis, it's called, the idea that human hunting pressure drove megafauna extinctions worldwide. It's debated, and climate change definitely played a role too. But the correlation is hard to ignore. Humans arrive, big animals vanish. Over and over, every continent we colonized. While some humans were heading southeast to Australia, others were moving northeast, spreading across Asia and eventually into Europe. The archaeological evidence shows modern humans in the Middle East by at least 100,000 years ago. But those early populations seem to have died out or retreated. The successful, sustained colonization of Europe happened later, around 45 to 40,000 years ago. And Europe was occupied. The Neanderthals had been there for 200,000 years. They knew every valley, every cave, every migration route the animals took. They were perfectly adapted to Ice Age conditions. Modern humans arriving in Europe were the newcomers, the invaders, the ones who had to figure out how to survive in a landscape that was already spoken for. But they did survive, and not just survive, they thrived. Within 15,000 years, Neanderthals were gone, and modern humans had spread from the Mediterranean to the Arctic Circle. How? What did modern humans have that allowed them to succeed in Neanderthal territory? We'll explore that more deeply soon, but part of it was technology. The archaeological sites from this period show modern humans in Europe using a wider variety of tools than Neanderthals, more specialised implements for specific tasks, better weapons, particularly projectile weapons like the atlatl that allowed hunting from safer distances, tailored clothing made with bone needles, essential for surviving harsh winters, and probably more importantly, larger social networks. Evidence of trade and interaction between groups spread across huge territories. Neanderthals seem to have lived in smaller, more isolated bands. Modern humans were forming confederations, trading networks, social systems that linked multiple groups together. Information could flow through these networks. If one group discovered a better hunting technique or found a new food source, that information could spread to neighbouring groups. Collective intelligence operating at scale, that was the advantage. But Europe was just one direction. Modern humans were also spreading across northern and central Asia, adapting to some of the harshest environments on Earth. By 45,000 years ago, there's evidence of human occupation in Siberia, where winter temperatures regularly drop to minus 40 degrees Celsius or colder, where the sun barely rises for months during winter, where survival requires incredible resourcefulness, sophisticated technology, and detailed environmental knowledge. The people who colonized Siberia developed specialized cold weather adaptations, not biological adaptations, though there were some, cultural adaptations. They built sophisticated shelters, semi-subterranean houses with thick walls and small entrances to retain heat. They made layered clothing from animal furs, with the fur side facing in for some layers and out for others, creating insulation. They invented oil lamps, burning animal fat to provide light and heat during the long dark winters. They developed food storage techniques, freezing meat in permafrost, creating caches that would last through the lean months, and they figured out how to hunt the animals that thrived in those conditions: woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, reindeer, musk oxen. Big, dangerous animals that could feed a band for weeks but required careful planning and coordination to bring down. The diversity of human adaptations during this period is staggering. You've got coastal populations in Southeast Asia living in tropical conditions, eating seafood, dealing with monsoons and rainforests. You've got people in Central Asia adapting to continental climates, extreme temperature swings between summer and winter, living in grasslands and steppes. You've got European populations coping with Ice Age conditions, glaciers advancing and retreating, tundra and boreal forests. You've got Siberian populations in some of the coldest places humans have ever inhabited. And all of these different populations, they're innovating. They're solving problems, they're developing technologies and knowledge systems specific to their environments. And because they're all modern humans, all descended from the same African populations, they're all doing it with the same basic cognitive toolkit: symbolic thinking, language, social learning, cultural transmission. But they're applying that toolkit to radically different challenges and coming up with radically different solutions. This is convergent cultural evolution on a massive scale. Different populations independently figuring out how to survive in their specific environments, and the solutions vary enormously. The tools used by coastal Southeast Asian populations look nothing like the tools used by Siberian mammoth hunters. The housing is different, the clothing is different, the social organization is probably different. But they're all successful. They're all surviving, reproducing, passing on their knowledge to the next generation. And here's what's crucial. These populations aren't isolated. They're in contact, at least at the margins. Trade networks are forming, even across vast distances. Shells from the Mediterranean show up at sites hundreds of kilometers inland. Obsidian from specific volcanic sources in Anatolia appears at sites across a region. High-quality flint from Belgian sources shows up as far away as southern France. People are moving, trading, interacting, and when they interact, they exchange ideas. A hunting technique developed in one region can spread to neighbouring regions. A tool design can be copied and adapted. A solution to a common problem can be shared across populations. The network effects are kicking in. The more widespread humans become, the more total population increases, the more innovations appear, and the faster those innovations spread. It's a positive feedback loop. Growth enabling more growth. Innovation driving more innovation. By 35,000 years ago, modern humans had established populations in Africa, the Middle East, Europe, across Asia from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, in Australia and New Guinea. The only major land masses we hadn't reached yet were the Americas and the remote Pacific Islands, and those would come later. The Americas would be colonized sometime between 25 and 15,000 years ago. The exact timing is still debated. People walking across the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia to Alaska during glacial periods when sea levels were low enough to expose the connection. The Pacific Islands would be the last frontier, colonized much later, within the last few thousand years, by people with sophisticated seafaring technology who could navigate thousands of kilometers of open ocean. But the expansion from 70,000 to 30,000 years ago was the crucial period. That's when modern humans transformed from one regional population in Africa to a global species, present on every continent, adapted to every major environment, with a combined population in the millions. And everywhere we went, we brought our capacity for innovation, our social learning, our cultural evolution. We didn't just adapt to environments, we transformed them. We burned forests to create grasslands. We hunted megafauna to extinction. We diverted streams, built structures, left our mark on the landscape. For better or worse, humans were becoming a force of nature, an ecological pressure that other species had to contend with. The planet was changing because we were on it, and one of the most dramatic changes was what happened to our competitors, the other human species who had been thriving before we arrived. Because in every region modern humans colonized, the resident human populations disappeared. The Neanderthals vanished from Europe, the Denisovans disappeared from Asia. Homo erectus went extinct in Indonesia. By 30,000 years ago, one human species left standing. Just us. What happened during those encounters? How did modern humans replace populations that had been successfully living in those regions for hundreds of thousands of years? That's the question we need to answer next. Imagine you're walking through a valley in what will one day be called France. It's 42,000 years ago, early autumn. The leaves are turning gold and red, and there's a chill in the air that promises winter is coming. Your band has been travelling for weeks, following a river valley north, tracking the herds of reindeer that migrate through this region every year. You've heard stories from other bands about these valleys, about the caves that offer shelter, about the hunting grounds rich with game. But you've also heard something else, something that makes you cautious. There are others here, not your people, different, stronger, stockier, with heavy brows and thick bones. They speak differently if they speak at all. Your elders call them the Old Ones. They've been here forever, or so the stories say, and this is their territory. You're the newcomer, the invader really, though you don't think of it that way. You're just following the food, looking for winter shelter. But as you crest a hill and look down into the next valley, you see smoke rising from a cave entrance. A fire, which means people. You're about to meet the Neanderthals. The encounter between modern humans and Neanderthals is one of the most fascinating and tragic stories in human prehistory. For at least 10,000 years, probably longer, these two species lived in the same landscapes, hunted the same animals, sheltered in the same caves. Not everywhere, not all the time. But the overlap was real and sustained. In the Middle East, modern humans and Neanderthals seem to have coexisted for perhaps 20,000 years, from around 50,000 to 30,000 years ago. In Europe, the overlap was shorter, maybe 10 to 15,000 years, from around 45,000 to 30,000 years ago. That's not just a brief encounter, that's hundreds of generations living in proximity, sharing territory, competing for resources, and as we now know definitively, sometimes producing children together. The evidence for interaction between the two species is written in our genes. In the late 21st century, researchers managed to sequence DNA from Neanderthal bones. Ancient DNA, degraded and fragmentary, but enough to reconstruct the Neanderthal genome, and when they compared it to modern human genomes, they found something remarkable. If you're of European, Asian, or Native American descent, somewhere between 1 and 4% of your DNA is Neanderthal, not metaphorically, literally. You carry Neanderthal genes. Your ancestors interbred with Neanderthals, and those hybrid offspring survived, reproduced, and passed on their mixed heritage down through the generations to you. This was shocking when it was first discovered because the prevailing theory had been complete replacement. Modern humans arrived in Europe, Neanderthals died out, no interbreeding, no mixing. But the DNA doesn't lie. There was interbreeding, probably not a lot. The genetic evidence suggests relatively few interbreeding events, maybe groups meeting at the margins of their territories, occasional interactions that led to mixed offspring. But it happened, and some of those Neanderthal genes have persisted in modern human populations because they were useful. Genes involved in immune function, in skin and hair characteristics, in metabolism. One particularly interesting Neanderthal gene variant that's common in people of Tibetan descent helps with high-altitude adaptation, though that one actually came from Denisovans, another species we interbred with. But the point stands. We didn't just replace Neanderthals, we absorbed them. They're not extinct in the traditional sense, they live on in us. Every person outside of Africa carries a piece of Neanderthal heritage. But let's go back to that valley, to that moment of encounter. What would it have actually been like when modern humans and Neanderthals met? We don't know, obviously. We don't have written records or oral histories from that time. But we can piece together a picture from the archaeological evidence and from what we know about both species. First, they would have recognized each other as similar but different. Neanderthals looked human. They walked upright, used tools, controlled fire, wore clothing probably. At a distance you might not immediately notice the differences, but up close the Neanderthal build would be striking. Stockier, more muscular, with that distinctive heavy brow ridge and elongated skull. The facial features would be different too, larger noses projecting mid-face, a different chin structure. Could they communicate? If both species had language, even if the languages were different, they could probably work out basic communication. Gestures, pointing, demonstration. The same way modern humans with no shared language can communicate essential information. This is our territory. Those animals are ours. Stay away or we'll defend what's ours. Or maybe, the hunting is good in that valley. The caves there have water. We can share. We don't know what the typical interaction was like. Friendly, hostile, wary coexistence, probably all of the above, depending on circumstances, individuals, resources. When food was scarce, competition would be fierce. When food was abundant, maybe tolerance was easier. But one thing is certain, they were competing for the same resources. Both species hunted the same animals: reindeer, bison, wild horses, woolly rhinoceros. Both species sought shelter in caves, especially during winter when protection from the elements was crucial. There are sites in Europe where we find both Neanderthal and modern human artifacts, sometimes in different layers showing they used the same cave at different times, sometimes in the same layers suggesting they might have been there simultaneously. The Chateauperonian culture is a fascinating piece of evidence here. It's an archaeological culture found in France and northern Spain, dated to between 45,000 and 40,000 years ago. The stone tools are a mix of Neanderthal techniques and what look like modern human innovations. There are bone tools, ornamental objects, even possible art. For years, researchers debated whether this was made by Neanderthals or by modern humans. DNA analysis of bone fragments from Chateauperonian sites eventually settled it. Neanderthals made these tools, which means Neanderthals were either independently inventing more sophisticated technology, or they were copying what they saw modern humans doing. Cultural exchange. Neanderthals seeing modern human tools and thinking, that's clever, I can make that. Or maybe even direct teaching, though that's speculation. But the Chateauperonian culture appears right at the time when modern humans were entering Europe. The timing is too perfect to be coincidence. Neanderthals were responding to the presence of modern humans, adapting, trying to keep up technologically. This is important because it shows Neanderthals were capable of innovation, capable of learning new behaviours. They weren't some primitive, unchanging species. They were smart, flexible, able to adopt new ideas, but it wasn't enough. Despite their best efforts, despite their physical advantages, despite 200,000 years of successful occupation of Europe, Neanderthals disappeared. The last known Neanderthal population survived in isolated refugia, protected pockets where they hung on longer than elsewhere. Gibraltar, at the southern tip of Spain, some caves in Croatia and Italy. The latest dates we have for Neanderthal remains are around 30,000 years ago, though some sites might be slightly more recent. By 28,000 years ago, they're definitely gone. Everywhere. The entire species extinct. What happened? This is one of the biggest questions in paleoanthropology, and the answer is we don't fully know, probably multiple factors working together. Let's start with competition. Modern humans and Neanderthals were competing for the same resources, and in competition, small advantages compound over time. Modern humans seem to have had better long-range weapons. The atlatl, for instance, allowed spear throwing from greater distances with more force. Archaeological evidence suggests Neanderthals primarily hunted with thrusting spears, getting close to dangerous prey, riskier, more likely to result in injuries. And Neanderthal skeletons show a lot of injuries, broken bones that healed, trauma consistent with close contact with large animals. Modern human skeletons from the same period show fewer traumatic injuries. Better weapons meant safer hunting. Safer hunting meant lower mortality rates. Lower mortality means more people surviving to adulthood. Small advantage, but it adds up. Dietary breadth might have been another factor. Archaeological evidence suggests modern humans exploited a wider range of food sources than Neanderthals. Neanderthals were primarily focused on large game hunting. Modern humans hunted large game too, but they also fished, gathered plants intensively, hunted small game, collected shellfish when near coasts. Dietary diversity is a buffer against resource fluctuations. If the reindeer migration fails one year, a population dependent solely on reindeer hunting is in trouble. But a population that can switch to fishing or intensive plant gathering or small game can survive the shortfall. Social networks were probably crucial too. The archaeological evidence suggests modern humans lived in larger groups and maintained connections with other groups across wider territories. Trade networks, exchange systems, social alliances. When one group was struggling, they could get help from allied groups. Information could flow across these networks. The hunting is failing here, but there's good fishing 3 valleys over. Neanderthals seem to have lived in smaller, more isolated bands. The archaeological evidence shows less long-distance movement of materials, less evidence of widespread trade or interaction between groups. When a Neanderthal band struggled, they were more on their own. No larger network to fall back on. And here's where modern human cognitive capabilities might have made the difference. Not individual intelligence, remember. Neanderthals had bigger brains, but collective intelligence, the ability to coordinate large groups, to share information efficiently, to build on accumulated knowledge. Modern humans had fully developed language as far as we can tell. Complex syntax, large vocabulary, the ability to discuss abstract concepts and plan for the future. Neanderthals might have had language too, but maybe not as fully developed. Maybe their communication was more limited, more concrete. If you can communicate more precisely, you can coordinate more effectively. You can share detailed knowledge about animal behavior, about where resources are, about techniques that work. You can teach complex multi-step processes. You can tell stories that encode important information in memorable forms. Climate change was definitely a factor too. The period from 50,000 to 30,000 years ago was climatically unstable. Rapid fluctuations between warmer and colder conditions. The Dansgaard-Oeschger events, they're called. Abrupt climate shifts that could happen in decades. Temperatures swinging up or down by several degrees Celsius in a human lifetime. Animal populations would respond to these shifts, migrating, changing their ranges. Plant communities would shift. A species perfectly adapted to stable Ice Age conditions might struggle with rapid, unpredictable change. Neanderthals had thrived in Ice Age Europe for 200,000 years. They were cold weather specialists. When conditions changed rapidly, they might have been less able to adapt than modern humans, who were more generalists, more flexible. But I want to be clear. None of these factors alone explains Neanderthal extinction. It wasn't just that modern humans had better weapons or better social networks or more flexible diet. It was all of these things together, plus probably factors we haven't identified. Small disadvantages piling up. And over thousands of years, those small disadvantages added up to demographic decline. Neanderthal populations shrinking, becoming more isolated, losing genetic diversity. Once populations get small enough, they become vulnerable to random events. A bad winter, a disease outbreak, a failed migration. Things that a large, healthy population could weather become existential threats for a small, struggling population. Some researchers think there might have been violence between the species. Direct conflict, modern humans actively killing Neanderthals or driving them from prime territory. It's possible. Humans are certainly capable of violence, and competition for resources can turn deadly. But we don't have strong archaeological evidence for systematic warfare. No mass graves of Neanderthals killed by modern humans. No fortifications or weapons specifically designed for fighting other humans from this period. If violence happened, it was probably sporadic, opportunistic, not organized genocide. Disease is another possibility. Modern humans coming from Africa might have carried tropical diseases that Neanderthals had no immunity to. This is how many human populations were devastated in later history. Europeans arriving in the Americas brought smallpox and measles that killed up to 90% of Native American populations. Maybe something similar happened with Neanderthals. Modern humans as disease vectors, inadvertently spreading pathogens that Neanderthals couldn't resist. But again, we don't have direct evidence. Ancient DNA can sometimes show signs of disease, but we haven't found clear evidence of pandemic-level die-offs in Neanderthal populations. What we do see in the archaeological record is a pattern of range contraction. Neanderthals disappearing from Eastern Europe first, then Central Europe, then Western Europe, retreating into smaller and smaller refugia. The last populations clinging to existence in the most remote protected areas, southern Spain, islands in the Mediterranean, and then they're gone. By 30,000 years ago, modern humans are the only human species in Europe. The Neanderthals who had shaped that landscape for 200 millennia had vanished. Absorbed partly into modern human populations through interbreeding, yes, but as a distinct species, as a people with their own identity and culture, extinct. There's something profoundly sad about this. The Neanderthals weren't monsters or primitive brutes. They were people. They cared for their injured. They buried their dead. They made art, or at least the beginnings of it. They survived and thrived through ice ages and warm periods, through countless generations, through challenges we can barely imagine. And then they met us. And within a few thousand years, they were gone. Not because they were inferior. In many ways, they were superior. Stronger, tougher, better adapted. But they were up against a species that had cracked the code of cultural evolution, that could accumulate knowledge across generations and share it across populations, that could adapt culturally faster than biology could evolve, and in that competition, individual advantages didn't matter as much as collective capabilities. Here's the thing that should give us pause. If you're of European or Asian descent, you're about 2% Neanderthal. They're in you. Their genes coding for your immune system, your skin pigmentation, your metabolism. Every person outside Africa carries this heritage. The Neanderthals didn't completely disappear. They became part of us. But they lost their identity, their culture, their languages if they had them, their unique way of being human. That's gone, and we're the reason. Not through malice necessarily, not through deliberate genocide, but through competition and demographic replacement. We were just slightly better at spreading, at adapting, at innovating, and over thousands of years that slight edge made all the difference. The same pattern played out across the world. Modern humans encountering other human species, Denisovans in Asia, who we also interbred with, Homo erectus in Indonesia, Homo floresiensis on Flores, and every time the same result. Within a few thousand years of a modern human arrival, the resident species disappears. We weren't just spreading across the planet, we were replacing everyone else who was already there. By 30,000 years ago, we were the last humans standing, the only survivors of millions of years of human evolution. All those other species, all those different ways of being human, extinct. Just us left. And the question we have to ask is, what made the difference? What did we have that they didn't? Because it wasn't strength. It wasn't brain size. It wasn't physical adaptation. It was something else. Something subtle but overwhelmingly powerful. And the answer, as we're about to explore, had everything to do with how we work together. So what was the difference? If Neanderthals were stronger, if they had bigger brains, if they were perfectly adapted to Ice Age Europe, why did we win and they lose? The answer isn't something you can see in a skeleton. It's not written in bone density or brain volume or muscle attachment points. The answer is social. It's about networks, about how humans connected with each other, shared information, built systems of cooperation that extended far beyond the immediate family group. And the evidence for this is scattered across the landscape in ways that archaeologists can track. In fragments of stone carried hundreds of kilometers from their source, in shells from distant coasts found in inland caves, in similarities of art and tools across vast geographic ranges. The story isn't about individual humans being better, it's about human groups being more connected. Let's start with something concrete. You're living in what will one day be southern France, 40,000 years ago. Your band camps near a river, following the seasonal rounds that your people have followed for generations. You hunt reindeer, gather plants, fish in the summer when the salmon run. It's a good life, generally. Enough food, shelter in caves during winter, community. One day, a stranger arrives. Not from a neighbouring band, someone you'd recognise. A true stranger, from far away, speaking with an accent you can barely understand. But through gestures and the few words you share, you communicate. This person has travelled for weeks, following the river valleys, visiting different bands along the way. They're carrying things, beautiful things, shells from the ocean, days and days of travel away, polished and pierced, ready to be strung as beads. They're willing to trade these shells for something you have. High-quality flint, maybe, from the deposits near your territory, or furs from the animals you hunt, or information, knowledge about where the herds are moving, what the hunting is like in different regions, techniques that work for taking down dangerous prey. You make the trade. The stranger stays for a few days, shares stories around the fire, shows your people a new way to attach stone points to spear shafts that works better than your current method. Then they move on, heading to the next band, carrying your flint with them, taking your stories and knowledge to share elsewhere. This is the network in action. And it's happening everywhere, connecting hundreds of groups across thousands of square kilometers. The archaeological evidence for these exchange networks is striking once you know what to look for. Shells from the Mediterranean coast, specifically from beaches in Italy, have been found at sites in Belgium. That's over 1,000 kilometers as the crow flies, much farther following walkable routes. Someone carried those shells, or the shells were passed from group to group in a chain of exchanges. Either way, it means connection. High-quality flint from specific sources in Belgium appears at sites across France and into Germany. Obsidian from volcanic sources in Central Europe shows up hundreds of kilometers away. These aren't just random occurrences. The patterns are consistent enough across time that they represent established networks, regular contact between groups, systematic exchange. And here's what makes this so important. When materials move, information moves with them. The person carrying Mediterranean shells to Belgium doesn't just bring physical objects. They bring stories, news about other groups, information about where resources are abundant or scarce, techniques they've learned from other bands, ideas about how to make better tools or hunt more effectively. Each exchange is an opportunity for knowledge transfer. Now imagine this happening constantly, across generations, across wide geographic areas. Modern human bands in Europe weren't isolated. They were nodes in a vast information network, and information is power. If your band discovers a better way to process hides, that knowledge can spread through the network. Within a generation, dozens of bands are using the improved technique. Then someone in another band refines it further, and that improvement spreads too. Knowledge accumulates, technology advances, not because any individual is smarter, but because good ideas can travel and build on each other. Compare this to what we know about Neanderthals. The archaeological evidence suggests their exchange networks were much more limited. Materials moved shorter distances. There's less evidence of widespread contact between groups. Neanderthal bands seem to have been more isolated, more self-sufficient, more territorially bounded. This makes sense given their lifestyle. Neanderthals were ambush hunters primarily. They needed to know their territory intimately. Every hiding spot, every game trail, every seasonal pattern of their prey. That kind of knowledge is local, specific, tied to place. Moving around a lot, interacting with distant groups, that might not have been as valuable to their survival strategy. Modern humans were using projectile weapons more, which allowed hunting in more open environments, which meant they didn't need to be as tied to specific territories. They could be more mobile, more willing to travel, more open to exchange with other groups. But the real insight here is about group size. Modern humans seem to have lived in larger bands and maintained connections with more total individuals than Neanderthals did. The archaeological evidence for this is indirect but suggestive. Modern human sites often show larger occupation areas, more hearths, more evidence of more people living together. Neanderthal sites tend to be smaller, suggesting smaller group sizes. Why does group size matter? Because of the grandmother hypothesis. And this is fascinating. Most mammals don't live much past their reproductive years. Once females stop being able to produce offspring, natural selection doesn't care what happens to them. They're reproductively dead ends. But humans, human females specifically, live for decades after menopause. Your grandmother, your great-grandmother, women who haven't been able to have children for 20 or 30 years but are still very much alive, still part of the community, still contributing. Why would evolution preserve this? Because post-reproductive women are incredibly valuable. They're repositories of knowledge. A woman who's lived for 60 or 70 years has seen everything. Multiple cycles of seasons, of animal migrations. She's lived through droughts and abundant years, harsh winters and mild ones. She knows which plants are edible and which are deadly because she's had 70 years to learn. She knows how to process difficult foods, how to predict weather patterns, how to read subtle signs in the environment, and crucially, she's not burdened with infant care anymore. She can teach. She can help raise her grandchildren, passing on skills and knowledge. She can mentor younger women, showing them techniques that take years to master. She's the community's library, and libraries are valuable. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies show that the presence of grandmothers significantly increases child survival rates. Kids with living grandmothers are more likely to survive to adulthood because grandmothers provide food, childcare, knowledge, and support. They're backup, redundancy in the system. If a mother dies in childbirth, the grandmother can help raise the orphaned children. If resources are scarce, grandmothers, no alternative food sources that younger people might not. This is called the grandmother effect, and it's uniquely human, or at least highly developed in humans compared to other primates. Modern humans might have lived longer than Neanderthals on average, meaning more grandmothers, more knowledge transmission across 3 or even 4 generations. A child learning not just from parents but from grandparents, and even great-grandparents, is accumulating wisdom from potentially 100 years of experience. That's a massive advantage. But it only works if your social structure supports it, if you're living in groups large enough and stable enough that elders can be cared for and valued. Larger group sizes enable another crucial advantage: specialization. In a band of 20 people, everyone needs to be a generalist. Everyone needs to know how to hunt, gather, make tools, find water, navigate. There's not enough people to have specialists, but in a band of 50 or 80 people, you can afford to have individuals who focus on specific skills. Someone becomes the expert tracker, spending more time than others learning to read subtle signs, becoming incredibly good at it. Someone else becomes the expert toolmaker, developing techniques and refinements that less practiced hands can't achieve. Someone specializes in plant knowledge, learning every edible species, every medicinal herb, every processing technique. Someone becomes the expert hide tanner, the master of turning raw animal skins into soft, durable leather. These specialists aren't full-time professionals. Everyone still contributes to basic survival. But having people who are exceptionally good at critical skills raises the capability of the entire group. And here's the network effect again. When groups interact, specialists can learn from each other. The best toolmaker from one band meets the best toolmaker from another band, and they share techniques. Both groups benefit from that exchange. Innovation happens faster because specialists are building on each other's work, not just reinventing solutions independently. Social cooperation extended to hunting too. There's evidence that modern humans were conducting larger, more coordinated hunts than earlier humans. Sites showing mass kills of animals, dozens or hundreds of individuals driven off cliffs or into corrals or trapped in some way. This requires planning, organization, coordinating the movements of many hunters, positioning people in the right places, timing the drive precisely. It's easier to do with 20 or 30 hunters than with 10. More people means you can attempt more ambitious hunts, bringing down larger animals or taking multiple animals at once. The payoff is bigger, enough meat to feed a large group for an extended time, but it requires trust, cooperation, the ability to work together toward a common goal. Modern humans were really good at this. We're the most cooperative, large-brained species on the planet. We cooperate with non-relatives in ways that most animals don't. We form alliances with strangers, trade with people we've never met, coordinate actions with hundreds or thousands of individuals. This isn't normal in nature. Most cooperation happens between relatives or in small groups with repeated interactions where you know everyone personally. But humans developed social technologies that enabled cooperation at scale. Gift-giving is one example. You give someone a gift, a valuable object or food, with no immediate expectation of return. This creates a social debt, a sense of obligation. Later, maybe weeks or months later, the recipient reciprocates with a gift of their own. This simple exchange does several things. It builds relationships across time, it creates bonds of mutual obligation, it redistributes resources, smoothing out fluctuations in who has what, and it extends your network of allies, people who owe you and whom you owe, creating a web of reciprocal relationships that you can draw on in times of need. The archaeological evidence shows this happening. Exotic materials being exchanged as gifts, objects that have value not for their utility but for their rarity or beauty. Shell beads, carved figurines, unusual stones. These are social currencies, objects that strengthen bonds between individuals and groups. Marriage between groups is another social technology. You send a daughter to marry into a neighbouring band, or you accept a woman from another band as a bride for one of your young men. This creates kinship ties between groups. Your band and their band are now related, connected by blood. You're more likely to cooperate, to help each other, to share information and resources. These alliance networks could extend across vast territories, linking dozens of groups together in webs of kinship and obligation. Ritual and ceremony probably played a role too. Shared rituals create group identity, reinforce social bonds, communicate values and expectations. When multiple bands gather for ceremonies, seasonal gatherings, initiation rites, it's an opportunity for the network to physically come together. Young people meet potential marriage partners, alliances are renewed, disputes are resolved, information is exchanged, stories are shared, the social fabric is maintained and strengthened. We can't observe these rituals directly, but we can infer them from the archaeological record. Sites that seem to be gathering places, large enough to accommodate more people than a single band. Rock art that might have been created during ceremonies, depicting important stories or spiritual concepts. The existence of art itself suggests shared symbolic systems, common languages of meaning that transcend individual groups. And language, of course, is the ultimate social technology, the ability to communicate complex ideas precisely, to tell stories that encode important information, to argue and persuade and explain. Language allows cooperation at scales that would be impossible without it. You can coordinate hunts involving dozens of people because you can explain the plan, assign roles, adjust strategies on the fly. You can maintain relationships with people you rarely see because you can talk about them, remember them, tell stories about them. You can accumulate and transmit vast amounts of knowledge because language is so much more efficient than demonstration alone. There's a concept in anthropology called the collective brain hypothesis. The idea that human intelligence isn't really about individual smarts. It's about our ability to pool knowledge across individuals and across generations. One person can only know so much, can only figure out so much in a lifetime. But if you can learn from everyone in your group, and everyone in your group can learn from their predecessors, knowledge accumulates. Culture becomes a ratchet that only turns one direction. Each generation starts from where the previous generation left off, adds their own discoveries, passes the expanded knowledge base to the next generation. This is cumulative cultural evolution, and it's humanity's superpower. It's how we went from simple stone tools to spacecraft in the blink of an evolutionary eye. And here's the crucial insight. The collective brain doesn't depend on individual intelligence. It depends on population size, interconnectedness, and the fidelity of cultural transmission. A population of 1,000 people who are well connected and have good methods of teaching will out-invent a population of 100 disconnected geniuses. Because the 1,000 connected people can share ideas, build on each other's discoveries, refine and improve innovations collectively. The 100 isolated geniuses each have to figure everything out from scratch. A Neanderthal one-on-one could probably outthink any modern human. Bigger brain, excellent individual cognitive capabilities, deep knowledge of their environment. But 50 modern humans working together, sharing information, building on each other's ideas, coordinating their actions, they could outthink the entire Neanderthal population. Not because any individual modern human was smarter, but because the network was more powerful than the nodes. This is why modern humans won. Not strength, not brain size, not individual capability, networks, social cooperation. The ability to work together in larger groups, to maintain connections across wider territories, to share information efficiently, to accumulate knowledge across generations, to specialize in trade and form alliances. We were more connected, and in the long run, connection beats everything else. Your advantage wasn't your brain. It was your grandmother, and her grandmother, and the network of allies and trading partners and distant cousins who shared information and innovations across a continent. It was the person who walked for weeks to bring shells from the ocean, carrying news and techniques and ideas along with the trade goods. It was the gathering where 3 bands came together and the best toolmaker from each group shared techniques, raising everyone's capabilities. It was the marriage that created kinship ties between groups who might otherwise compete. It was the stories told around fires, encoding survival knowledge in memorable forms that children could learn and remember and pass on. This is what made us human. Not individual brilliance, but collective intelligence. Not isolated genius, but networked creativity. We became a species whose power lay not in our individual members, but in our connections, our cooperation, our ability to think together. And once that system was in place, once the networks were established and the cultural ratchet was turning, we became unstoppable. By 30,000 years ago, that system had spread across the world. Modern humans everywhere, adapting to every environment, innovating constantly, sharing discoveries across vast networks. The takeover was complete. By 30,000 years ago, the transformation was complete. Look at a map of the world, trace the distribution of human populations. Africa, obviously, where it all started. The Middle East fully occupied. Europe, from the Mediterranean to the edge of the Arctic ice sheets. Asia, from the western steppes to the Pacific coast. Southeast Asia and the islands of Indonesia, Australia and New Guinea, separated from Asia by rising seas, but connected to each other by lower water levels, every major landmass except the Americas and Antarctica. And the Americas were next, just a matter of time before someone walked across the Bering Land Bridge during one of the glacial periods when sea levels dropped low enough to expose the connection between Siberia and Alaska. The human takeover was essentially complete, and everywhere humans went, we changed things. Let's talk about what happened to the animals, because this is one of the most dramatic and controversial aspects of human expansion. Wherever modern humans arrived in a new place, within a few thousand years the large animals started disappearing. The megafauna extinctions, they're called. And the pattern is so consistent, so geographically widespread, that it can't be coincidence. In Australia, humans arrived by at least 65,000 years ago. Within 10,000 years, the continent had lost most of its giant marsupials. Diprotodon, the rhinoceros-sized wombat, extinct. The giant short-faced kangaroos, some standing over 2 meters tall, extinct. Megalania, the 7-meter monitor lizard, extinct. Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion, extinct. The giant flightless birds, extinct. Over 85% of Australia's megafauna vanished. In Eurasia, the extinctions were more gradual but equally dramatic. Woolly mammoths, which had thrived across the northern continents for hundreds of thousands of years, began declining. By 10,000 years ago, they survived only on remote Arctic islands, and by 4,000 years ago, even those last populations were gone. Woolly rhinoceros, extinct. Cave lions, extinct. Cave bears, extinct. Giant ground sloths in South America, extinct when humans arrived there. Gomphotheres, elephant relatives that had survived for millions of years, extinct shortly after human colonization of the Americas. Glyptodonts, armadillo relatives the size of small cars, extinct. The pattern repeats on every continent humans colonized. The Pacific Islands tell the same story centuries later when Polynesian seafarers reached remote islands. Within generations of human arrival, the giant flightless birds, the moas of New Zealand, the elephant birds of Madagascar extinct. Large flightless ducks extinct. Giant tortoises on many islands extinct. Now, this is controversial because it's not entirely our fault. Climate change was happening during this period too. The end of the last ice age brought dramatic environmental shifts. As glaciers retreated, habitats changed. Grasslands turned to forests in some regions. Tundra became taiga. The animals adapted to ice age conditions faced challenges from changing climate regardless of human pressure. But the timing is too perfect to ignore. On continents where humans had been present for a long time, Africa and parts of Asia, the megafauna survived. African elephants, rhinoceros, lions, hippos, giraffes, they're still here. Asian elephants, tigers, water buffalo, they survived. These animals evolved alongside humans, developed wariness, learned to avoid human hunters over hundreds of thousands of years. But animals that had never encountered humans before, they had no fear. No evolutionary experience telling them that those upright apes were dangerous. And they paid for that innocence with extinction. Imagine being a giant ground sloth in South America 15,000 years ago. You've never seen a human. Your species has existed for millions of years. You're huge, the size of an elephant with enormous claws. No predator can seriously threaten you. Then these small, strange creatures appear. They're making odd noises, carrying sticks. You don't run because why would you? You've never needed to run from anything. And then the sticks start flying, with sharp points that penetrate your thick hide. You're wounded, confused, more sticks, more wounds. You try to flee but you're slow, adapted for browsing on high vegetation, not for speed. The strange creatures follow, throwing more sticks, working together, coordinating their attack in ways you can't comprehend. Eventually you fall, and the strange creatures descend on your body, cutting it apart with sharp stones, taking the meat. Your species will be extinct within a few thousand years. This is the overkill hypothesis. The idea that human hunting pressure was the primary driver of megafauna extinctions worldwide. It's debated, and certainly climate change contributed. But humans were incredibly effective hunters. We had sophisticated weapons, cooperative hunting strategies, the ability to target specific individuals, to track wounded animals for days, to coordinate drives and ambushes. We could hunt year-round, not just when we were hungry, because we could preserve and store meat. And we weren't just hunting for food, we were hunting for materials, mammoth ivory, thick hides, bones for tools. Sometimes we were hunting to eliminate competition, clearing dangerous predators from areas where we wanted to live. The archaeological evidence shows sites with dozens of mammoths killed, far more meat than a band could consume before spoilage. Wasteful by our standards, but these were people encountering abundance like they'd never seen. Animals with no fear standing there to be killed. Why not take advantage? And once the killing started, it was hard to stop. Because here's the thing about large, slow-reproducing animals. They're vulnerable to even modest hunting pressure. A mammoth takes years to reach sexual maturity, then produces only one calf every few years. If humans kill just a few % more mammoths than are being born, the population shrinks. Slowly at first, then faster as the population gets smaller and genetic diversity declines. Eventually you reach a point where the population can't recover, even if hunting stops. Too few individuals left, too inbred, too vulnerable to random events. Extinction becomes inevitable. We don't know if the people doing the hunting understood what they were causing. Did they notice the mammoths becoming scarcer, the herds shrinking year by year? Did they care? Did they try to conserve, to hunt more sustainably? We don't know, but the result is clear. Within a few thousand years of human arrival in most places, the big animals were gone, and humanity had become the most dominant predator Earth had ever seen. Not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most physically dangerous, but the most effective, the most widespread, the most adaptable, the most deadly. By 30,000 years ago, if you were a large animal that humans wanted to hunt, you were in serious trouble. But it wasn't just hunting. Humans were transforming landscapes in other ways too. Fire was a tool, and we used it extensively, burning vegetation to encourage new growth that would attract game animals, clearing forests to create grasslands, modifying ecosystems to suit our needs. The Aboriginal Australians developed this into a sophisticated land management system, fire stick farming they called it. Controlled burns at specific times of year to maintain the mix of habitats that supported the animals they hunted and the plants they gathered. It wasn't farming in the agricultural sense, wouldn't be for another 20,000 years. But it was deliberate landscape modification, humans reshaping the environment rather than just adapting to it. We were becoming an ecological force, a geological force really. The Anthropocene, some scientists call our current era, the age, when humans became the dominant influence shaping the planet. Most people think the Anthropocene started with the Industrial Revolution or agriculture, but you could argue it started 40,000 years ago, when behaviourally modern humans began spreading across the world, hunting megafauna to extinction, burning forests, building structures, leaving marks on the landscape that would persist for tens of thousands of years. Human population was growing too, not explosively, not like it would after agriculture, but steadily. The total global population 30,000 years ago was probably somewhere between 1 and 5 million people. That's a huge range because we're estimating from archaeological site density and making assumptions about how many people aren't represented in the archaeological record. But it's significantly more than the few 100,000 that existed 50,000 years ago. More people meant more pressure on resources, more innovation, more cultural diversity, more of everything. The Gravettian culture, which replaced the earlier Aurignacian culture in Europe around 33,000 years ago, shows continued innovation. New tool types, more sophisticated hunting weapons, increasingly elaborate art. The Venus figurines become more common during this period, suggesting they held some important cultural or religious significance that was spreading across populations. Architecture was developing too. Not monumental architecture, not yet, but more substantial structures than simple tents or cave shelters. In Eastern Europe, particularly in what's now Ukraine and Russia, archaeologists have found the remains of structures built from mammoth bones. Houses, essentially, with foundations made from carefully arranged mammoth skulls and long bones, walls filled in with hides and turf, probably covered with more hides for roofing. These structures were substantial, required significant labour to build, and were clearly intended for extended occupation. They suggest settled communities, at least seasonal settlements where bands would return year after year. The investment in building something that permanent only makes sense if you're planning to use it repeatedly. These mammoth bone houses also tell us something about resource use. To build one structure required the bones from dozens of mammoths. Were they hunting that many? Or were they scavenging bones from natural die-offs, from animals that died during harsh winters or got trapped in bogs? Probably both. But either way, they were utilising mammoth resources extensively, which might help explain why mammoth populations were declining. Stone tool technology continued advancing. The Solutrean culture in Western Europe, dating from around 22,000 to 17,000 years ago, produced some of the most beautiful stone tools ever made. Laurel leaf points, they're called, with facially flaked blades so thin and symmetrical they're almost works of art. Some are over 30 centimetres long but only a few millimetres thick. The skill required to make these without breaking them is extraordinary. These weren't utilitarian tools. They were prestige items, status symbols, demonstrations of skill, which tells you that society was becoming complex enough to have status differentiation, to value things beyond pure utility. Sewing technology was improving too. The needles were getting finer, more precisely made. Evidence from burials shows clothing sewn with thousands of beads in elaborate patterns, suggesting tailored garments that were carefully decorated. This is fashion, aesthetics, people caring about appearance and presentation. Trade networks were expanding. Materials moving even longer distances than before. Amber from the Baltic coast appearing at sites in France, seashells from the Mediterranean found in Central Europe, flint from specific sources being distributed across vast regions. The network we discussed earlier was growing denser, more extensive, more integral to human life. And remember, with materials comes information, ideas spreading, innovations diffusing, the collective brain growing more powerful as the network expanded. Music continued developing. More bone flutes have been found from this period, in more locations, suggesting music was becoming a widespread cultural practice, not just isolated experiments. Percussion instruments, too, though these are harder to identify archaeologically. But ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherers show drumming and rhythm as central to ceremonies and gatherings. No reason to think our ancestors 30,000 years ago were different. Cave art reached new heights of sophistication. Lascaux Cave in France, painted around 17,000 years ago, contains some of the most stunning prehistoric art ever discovered. The Hall of Bulls shows aurochsen, wild cattle, rendered in exquisite detail, some over 5 meters long. The colours are vivid even after 17,000 years, reds and yellows and blacks applied with brushes and blown through tubes to create shading and texture. The Lascaux artist understood perspective, composition, movement. They were masters of their craft, working in a tradition that must have been refined over thousands of years, knowledge passed down from teacher to student across countless generations. This wasn't primitive. This was sophisticated, accomplished art that stands alongside anything produced in human history. And it was being created by people living in Ice Age Europe, hunting reindeer and bison, sheltering in caves, living lives that seem impossibly remote from ours. But their minds worked just like ours. Their aesthetic sense was just like ours. They looked at the world and saw beauty and wanted to capture it, to share it, to make something that would last. The person who painted those bulls at Lascaux 17,000 years ago, they're your ancestor, not metaphorically. If you're of European descent, you almost certainly carry their genes, and even if you're not, you're closely related. All modern humans trace back to the populations that existed during this period. We're all cousins, descended from the people who made this transformation, who spread across the world, who created art and music and stories that still echo in everything we do today. By 25,000 years ago, the human takeover was absolute. We were everywhere large mammals could live. We were the dominant predator in every ecosystem. Our populations were growing, our cultures were diversifying, our technology was advancing, and we'd replaced every other human species, absorbing some of their genes but eliminating them as distinct populations, as separate ways of being human. It happened fast in evolutionary terms, 20,000 years from the first stirrings of behavioral modernity to total global dominance. That's nothing. 400 generations maybe. You could line up your ancestors from then to now, 400 people, and walk past them in an afternoon. And in that blink of time, everything changed. We went from one species among many to the only humans left. From regional populations in Africa and the Middle East to global distribution. From simple tool users to sophisticated hunters with advanced weapons. From isolated bands to interconnected networks spanning continents. From surviving in the environment to transforming it, the world would never be the same, and neither would we. Because here's what's crucial to understand. This transformation, this takeover, it set the stage for everything that came after. Agriculture, which would emerge in just another 10,000 years. Civilization, cities, writing, technology, everything we think of as human progress. None of it happens without what happened 40,000 years ago. The behavioral changes, the social networks, the capacity for cumulative cultural evolution, that's the foundation. That's what made us capable of building on our achievements, of creating systems more complex than any individual could design, of cooperating in groups of millions instead of dozens. We became, for the first time, a species whose evolution was driven more by culture than by genes, whose survival depended more on what we knew than on how we were built, whose success came from working together, from sharing information, from standing on the shoulders of everyone who came before. And once we crossed that threshold, once the cultural ratchet was turning, there was no going back. We were committed. For better and for worse, we'd become the humans we are today, the planet's dominant species, the shapers of ecosystems, the only survivors of millions of years of human evolution, and all of it, everything we have, everything we are, traces back to that moment 40,000 years ago when something changed in the human mind, when art appeared, when innovation exploded, when networks formed and knowledge began accumulating, when we woke up. So here we are, tens of thousands of years later, descendants of those first modern humans who painted caves and carved figurines and spread across the world. You're lying somewhere comfortable, listening to this story, and you're connected to them in the most direct way possible. Those people are your ancestors, not distant relatives, not metaphorical connections, actual direct lineage, Your great-great-great-grandmother going back 1,000 generations painted those caves or knew the people who did. The thoughts they thought, you're thinking. The brains they used to create art and innovate tools and tell stories around fires, that's the brain you're using right now. Nothing fundamental has changed. When you close your eyes tonight, you're using a mind that was shaped 40,000 years ago. When you dream with the same consciousness that looked at a cave wall and decided to paint a horse. The capacity for language, for symbolic thought, for cooperation, for creativity, it's all still there. You carry it forward. Every piece of art you've ever appreciated, every story you've loved, every moment of connection with another person, every innovation you've witnessed or contributed to, it's all part of the same cultural evolution that started when something sparked in the human mind all those millennia ago. We still don't know exactly what changed. The mystery remains. Was it language? A genetic mutation? Population density reaching critical mass? Climate stress forcing innovation? Probably all of these things together, and probably other factors we haven't identified. But the result is clear. We became human in the fullest sense. We became the species that tells stories, that creates beauty, that builds on what came before, that works together to achieve things no individual could accomplish alone. The Neanderthals are gone, but they're in you. The Denisovans disappeared, but their genes survive in modern populations. The megafauna are extinct, and that's on us. A reminder that human power comes with consequences, but we're still here. Still creating, still innovating, still connected to each other in networks that now span the entire planet instantaneously. The takeover that started 40,000 years ago is still happening, still unfolding, still transforming the world, and you're part of it. You've always been part of it. If you enjoyed this journey through deep history, maybe leave a like and let me know in the comments what struck you most about this story. But for now, rest easy. You're the product of 40,000 years of survivors, innovators, artists, storytellers. You carry their spark, and that's something worth sleeping peacefully about. Sweet dreams.